The air over the Nile was still dark when the first sounds of movement began to rise from the village. Not loud sounds. Nothing sudden. Only the soft shifting of sandals over packed earth. A quiet cough behind a mud brick wall. The low crackle of a cooking fire waking slowly from the night. Far away, somewhere beyond the sleeping homes, river water moved against reeds in the darkness. Slow water. Patient water. The same water that had flowed beside the fields for longer than anyone could remember. Most people were already awake. In ancient Egypt, the world did not soften for children as they grew older. Life began early. The days were long. Heat pressed down from the sky almost every month of the year. Bodies became tired quickly. Hands roughened young. Even small children learned how to carry things, sweep floors, knead bread, gather water, or watch animals before the morning sun climbed too high. The village rested beside the Nile in a long stretch of fertile earth between pale desert hills. During the day, the sand beyond the fields glowed white under the sunlight. But now, before dawn, the desert looked blue and quiet beneath the fading stars. Inside one small home, a boy slept beside his brothers on a woven reed mat laid directly on the floor. The room smelled faintly of dust, bread, and smoke from the cooking fire that had burned earlier in the evening. The walls around them were made from dried mud brick. Thick walls that held some of the night coolness for a little while longer. There was no furniture except for a few low stools, baskets, jars, and folded cloths resting against the wall. A small oil lamp had burned through most of the night. Now its flame had nearly disappeared. The boy's mother was already awake. She moved quietly through the darkness, careful not to step on sleeping feet. Her knees ached from years of grinding grain against heavy stone. Her hands carried tiny scars from cooking fires and rough baskets. She wrapped a simple linen cloth around herself and stepped outside into the early air. The village was beginning to stir. Thin smoke rose from rooftops where women prepared the first fires of the day. Donkeys shifted in their sleep beside tethering posts. Somewhere nearby, a baby cried for only a moment before settling again into silence. The mother carried a clay jar toward the river path. The earth beneath her sandals felt cool for now, though everyone knew the heat would return before long. It always did. By midday the roads would shimmer beneath the sun, and workers would wipe sweat from their faces with dusty hands while trying to finish their tasks before exhaustion settled too deeply into their bodies. But early morning belonged to movement. Already, fishermen were preparing their boats along the Nile banks. Their narrow wooden vessels rocked gently against the water while nets were checked in silence. Men worked mostly without speaking. They were still waking fully themselves. The smell of wet reeds mixed softly with river mud and fish scales. A few older boys helped untangle rope beside the boats. Their eyes were heavy with sleep. Some had only rested a few hours before returning to work again. Childhood passed slowly in some ways, but quickly in others. There was little separation between being young and becoming useful. Farther inland, farmers prepared for another day in the fields. The river had given life to the land again after the flooding season. Dark soil spread across the farmland in rich bands beside the Nile. Green shoots covered many fields already. Barley moved gently in the dawn breeze. Workers carried wooden tools over their shoulders as they walked narrow dirt paths between irrigation channels. The world smelled of damp earth. A father walked with his young daughter beside him. She carried a small basket almost half the size of her body. She stumbled sometimes while walking through the uneven ground, but she kept going quietly. No one expected comfort from life. People rested when they could. They worked when they had to. The father spoke softly to her as they walked. He pointed toward the eastern horizon where pale gold light slowly spread across the sky. The sun would rise soon. For the people of ancient Egypt, morning always came with a feeling of duty. The day ahead already carried weight before it fully began. Crops needed tending. Water needed lifting. Animals needed feeding. Bread needed baking. Stone needed shaping. Records needed writing. Boats needed repairing. The labor never truly ended. And yet there were still moments of gentleness hidden inside the routine. A cool breeze passing through date palms before sunrise. The feeling of wet river water over tired hands. Fresh bread warming beside a clay oven. The soft hum of insects near irrigation canals. Children sleeping peacefully for a few moments longer while adults prepared the day. These small things mattered deeply because life itself was often hard on the body. As the sun finally rose over the horizon, the village slowly turned gold beneath the morning light. Shadows stretched long across the roads. Mud brick walls glowed softly. Birds moved through the reeds beside the Nile. The day had begun again. Inside workshops near the larger town farther south, craftsmen already sat cross-legged beside stone, wood, and copper tools. The rooms grew warm quickly after sunrise. Dust floated through narrow beams of light cutting in from small windows high in the walls. A young apprentice carried water jars from one side of the room to the other. His shoulders already hurt from the weight, though he said nothing about it. Older craftsmen rarely complained openly either. Most people simply accepted tiredness as part of ordinary life. The apprentice watched one sculptor carefully smooth the face of a limestone figure. Tiny flakes of pale stone drifted onto the floor. The room smelled dry and heavy. Outside the workshop, merchants arranged goods beneath stretched cloth awnings to protect them from the growing heat. Baskets filled with onions, beans, figs, fish, and bread lined the market road. Flies circled lazily in the warming air. A woman sat quietly beside jars of beer made from barley. Her youngest child slept beside her on folded cloth while she waited for buyers. From time to time she brushed dust away from the child's face with tired fingers. The marketplace slowly filled with sound. Not loud sound. Not chaos. Only the steady sound of daily survival. Sandals scraping stone. Goats bleating. Water sloshing inside clay jars. Voices speaking softly through the heat. The distant tapping of hammers against wood and copper. Everything moved slowly beneath the heavy sun. Even the dogs resting in narrow strips of shade barely lifted their heads. By late morning, the heat became difficult. Workers in the fields wrapped cloth around their heads while bending over rows of crops. Sweat darkened their linen clothing. Their backs ached from hours spent stooping beneath the sunlight. Children worked beside adults whenever they were strong enough. Some gathered fallen grain into baskets. Some carried water. Some chased birds from the fields. Some simply watched younger brothers and sisters while their parents labored nearby. A little boy sat beneath a sycamore tree beside the edge of a field while holding a sleeping baby in his lap. He looked toward the river with sleepy eyes as insects buzzed softly around him. The smell of warm mud drifted from the irrigation canals. Nearby, two men used a wooden shadove to lift water from the Nile into smaller channels feeding the crops. The work required constant movement. Lift. Step. Lower. Lift again. Their muscles burned beneath the heat, but the fields depended on the water. One of the men was missing several teeth. The other limped slightly from an old injury. Both continued working without pause. Life in ancient Egypt often wore the body down slowly over many years. Bones hardened from labor. Skin darkened beneath the sun. Joints stiffened early. Many people carried pain quietly through most of their lives. And still, each evening, families gathered together again inside their homes. That promise of rest carried people through the hottest hours. By midday, the village roads became quieter. Even animals searched for shade. Inside homes, women continued preparing food beside clay ovens that filled rooms with dry heat. Grain was ground against stone by hand. Bread dough was shaped slowly with practiced movements. Lentils simmered inside simple pots. Fish dried on woven mats beneath the sunlight outside. The work inside the home never truly stopped either. A grandmother sat near the doorway of one house while repairing torn linen clothing with careful fingers. Beside her, a young girl copied the movements quietly while learning how to sew. The older woman's face carried deep lines from years beneath the Egyptian sun. Her eyes looked tired but calm. Outside, dust moved slowly along the road as warm wind drifted through the village. Somewhere in the distance, temple music floated faintly through the heavy afternoon air. Soft drums. A flute. The sound traveled slowly across the heat before fading again into silence. Near the riverbank, fishermen rested beneath reed shelters after returning from the morning waters. Nets hung nearby to dry. A few men slept directly on the ground while others shared pieces of bread and fish in silence. The Nile moved beside them endlessly. Children sometimes swam near the shoreline during the hottest hours, though mothers warned them constantly about crocodiles hidden farther downriver. Still, children laughed quietly in the water while sunlight flashed across the river surface like moving gold. For a short time, the heat loosened its grip. Then work resumed again. Afternoon labor always felt heavier. Bodies slowed. Feet dragged through dust. Eyes narrowed against sunlight reflecting from pale stone walls. Inside one large estate near the edge of the town, servants carried water jars from room to room while wealthy officials rested in shaded courtyards. Palm leaves stirred gently overhead. Painted walls showed scenes of gardens, birds, and river life. Even here, servants rarely stopped moving. One young servant girl balanced a tray of figs carefully while trying not to stumble from exhaustion. She had awakened before sunrise like everyone else. Her feet hurt from walking over stone floors all day. But she lowered her eyes respectfully and continued her tasks in silence. In another room, a scribe sat cross-legged with reed brush and papyrus scrolls spread before him. The room was cooler than most. Still, sweat gathered along his neck while he worked. Writing demanded patience and long hours of concentration. Scribes held respected positions in Egyptian society because literacy was rare. Yet even this quieter work strained the body. Fingers cramped. Eyes tired from studying symbols for hours beneath flickering light. Outside the window, the town shimmered beneath afternoon heat. A donkey cart creaked slowly down the road. Workers carried stone blocks toward a construction site near the temple district. Their breathing sounded heavy beneath the weight. Dust clung to their skin. The smell of hot limestone filled the air. One worker paused briefly to wipe sweat from his forehead before continuing again. The overseer nearby watched carefully to keep the pace steady. Construction in ancient Egypt required enormous labor from ordinary people whose names would never be remembered by history. Most lives passed quietly. Most people simply worked, ate, rested, and endured. As afternoon slowly leaned toward evening, the sunlight softened slightly across the Nile Valley. Long shadows stretched once more over fields and rooftops. Birds circled above the riverbanks. The hardest part of the day was nearly over. Farmers began gathering tools. Children carried empty baskets home. Goat herds guided animals slowly through dusty roads back towards sleeping enclosures. The village breathed differently in the evening. People moved more slowly now. Voices softened. Faces looked worn from the long day. Inside homes, cooking fires glowed warmly against mud brick walls. The smell of fresh bread returned again to the streets. Lentil stew simmered quietly inside clay pots. Onion, garlic, and herbs drifted through the cooling air. Families gathered close together while darkness slowly approached the Nile. A father sat beside the doorway of his home while rubbing soreness from his knees. His youngest son leaned sleepily against his shoulder. Nearby, the mother divided bread carefully among the family. Meals were simple for most people. Bread, beer, onions, beans, fish when available, dates during certain seasons, sometimes figs, sometimes nothing more than coarse barley bread and watered beer after difficult harvests. Still, evening meals carried comfort because they meant the work had paused for a little while. Oil lamps flickered softly inside homes. Beyond the village, desert wind moved gently across open sand beneath a sky slowly filling with stars. The heat finally loosened from the earth. Workers rested aching feet. Children fell asleep mid-conversation beside their parents. Old people sat quietly outside doorways watching darkness settle over the Nile. And somewhere far beyond the sleeping fields, river water continued moving through the night exactly as it always had. Night settled fully across the Nile Valley with a softness that felt almost gentle after the long heat of the day. The river reflected scattered stars between dark stretches of moving water. Reeds whispered quietly along the banks whenever the wind shifted through them. Farther out beyond the farmland, the desert rested beneath pale moonlight, silent and endless. Inside the village, most fires had burned low. Only a few lamps still glowed behind small openings in mud brick walls. The smell of smoke lingered in the warm air along with traces of baked bread, fish oil, damp earth, and tired human bodies finally at rest. For many families, sleep came quickly. People in ancient Egypt rarely had the luxury of staying awake long into the night. The body simply gave in after hours of labor beneath the sun. Muscles became heavy. Eyes burned from dust and heat. Even children often slept deeply only moments after lying down. Inside one crowded home, a mother gently brushed sand from her daughter's hair before settling beside the other sleeping children. The room was small. Everyone shared the same space. Woven mats covered portions of the floor while baskets and clay jars rested against the walls. The youngest child shifted in sleep and pressed closer against his older brother. Outside, footsteps moved softly along the road. A night watchman carried a small oil lamp through the darkness while checking storage buildings and workshop doors. His sandals scraped lightly against packed earth. Sometimes he stopped to listen. Most nights there was little to hear beyond insects, distant dogs, and the steady breathing of the sleeping village. The Nile itself never truly slept. Fishing boats tied near the riverbank knocked gently against wooden posts. Water slipped around them with slow patience. Somewhere farther downstream, another village rested beneath the same moonlight. Another group of tired workers lay sleeping after another day that had demanded everything from their bodies. And then, slowly, the hours passed. The night cooled the land for a little while. Before dawn arrived again, the air carried a faint chill drifting off the river. Some people woke briefly during those hours and adjusted thin linen coverings over their shoulders before falling asleep once more. Others were already awake. Bakers often began work in darkness. Inside a small courtyard oven near the center of the village, two brothers prepared grain before sunrise. They moved slowly while still half asleep themselves. One poured crushed barley into a stone grinder while the other added water carefully to form dough. The grinding stone scraped rhythmically in the silence. Their mother fed dry reeds into the oven fire. Warm orange light flickered across her tired face while smoke drifted upward into the fading night sky. This would happen every morning. Again and again. For years. Bread formed the center of life for ordinary Egyptians. Nearly every meal depended on it. Grain had to be harvested, carried, crushed, sifted, mixed, shaped, and baked by human hands. The labor behind a simple loaf stretched across many people and many exhausting hours. Children learned these rhythms early. A little girl stood beside the grinder rubbing sleep from her eyes while trying to help push the heavy stone. Her small arms strained against the weight. She was too young to manage it well, but no one expected childhood to remain soft for long. Outside the home, darkness slowly turned gray. Roosters cried somewhere across the village. Donkeys shifted beside walls. A fisherman coughed while untangling nets near the riverbank. Morning was returning once more. As the eastern sky brightened, the Nile appeared again from the shadows like a long ribbon of silver blue stretching through the valley. Thin fog rested lightly over portions of the water. Palm trees stood motionless along the shore. The first workers began moving toward the fields. Most carried tools balanced across their shoulders. Wooden hoes, rope, baskets, clay jars filled with water. Their footsteps pressed quietly into the dusty paths between homes. A young boy followed behind his father carrying a bundle of reeds almost larger than himself. His face still looked sleepy. He had wanted to stay beside his mother longer inside the warm house. But the fields could not wait. The river decided the rhythm of nearly everything. When floodwaters rose, work changed. When waters lowered, planting began. When harvest season arrived, villages moved with urgency beneath the burning sun. The Nile gave life, but it also demanded constant labor from everyone living beside it. Along one irrigation canal, several men repaired a broken mud wall before water escaped into the wrong field. Their feet sank into wet soil while insects circled around their heads. One man used his bare hands to press thick mud back into place while another packed reeds tightly into the crack. The smell of wet earth rose strongly beneath the growing heat. Nearby, women gathered water into jars balanced carefully against their hips or shoulders. They spoke softly while waiting their turn beside the riverbank. Most conversations centered around ordinary things. A child with fever. A damaged roof after strong wind. Not enough grain stored for the coming months. An elderly parent growing weaker. Someone's missing goat. Daily life carried endless small concerns. The larger world beyond the Nile Valley mattered far less to ordinary workers than the immediate condition of their own bodies, families, and food supplies. Kings built monuments. Priests performed ceremonies. Officials recorded taxes. But most people spent their lives thinking about aching backs, dry fields, empty jars, and whether the bread would last through the week. As sunlight climbed higher, the village slowly filled again with movement. Smoke drifted upward from cooking fires. Goats wandered narrow lanes between homes. Merchants prepared market stalls beneath cloth coverings stretched against the sun. Children chased one another briefly before adults called them back toward chores. Near the larger town farther north, workers crowded into workshops before the worst heat arrived. Potters shaped wet clay upon spinning wheels while water dripped slowly from their fingers. Rows of unfinished jars lined shelves beside the walls waiting to dry. The room smelled cool at first. Mud. Water. Smoke. Clay dust. but later the air would grow thick and difficult beside the kill fires. A young apprentice carefully carried fresh pottery outside into the morning sunlight. He moved cautiously because one mistake could destroy hours of labor. His hands already showed tiny burns and cuts despite his age. Nearby, linen workers sat together spinning thread while speaking quietly among themselves. Long strands passed steadily through practiced fingers. One older woman leaned back occasionally to ease pain in her shoulders before continuing again. Bodies always carried the memory of labor. At the edge of town, stone workers chipped away at large limestone blocks beneath temporary shade coverings. The sharp tapping of tools echoed rhythmically through the warm air. Fine pale dust settled into hair, eyes, and lungs. Some workers wrapped cloth across their mouths while working. Others did not bother anymore. A foreman walked slowly among them watching progress. He carried a reed staff and wore cleaner linen than the laborers beneath him. Even so, sweat darkened his clothing within the first hours of daylight. No one escaped the Egyptian heat completely. By late morning the sun pressed heavily against rooftops and roads. Light reflected sharply from white stone walls. Dogs rested beneath carts. Even birds grew quieter during the hottest hours. In one shaded courtyard, a group of children sat together learning basic writing from an older scribe. They practiced symbols slowly upon broken pieces of pottery using reed pens dipped in ink. Most children would never become scribes. Most would continue the labor of their parents. Still, some families hoped literacy might spare a child from the hardest physical work someday. The scribe corrected mistakes patiently while sweat gathered along his forehead. Nearby, flies buzzed lazily around a bowl of dates left uncovered in the heat. One boy struggled to hold the reed pen properly because his hands were already roughened from field work. His fingernails carried traces of dirt that never fully disappeared. Outside the courtyard wall, life continued moving beneath the sunlight. Water sellers crossed the streets carrying heavy jars suspended from wooden poles. Servants hurried between homes delivering goods. Temple workers swept stone floors already warming beneath the day. A blind musician sat near the market entrance quietly plucking strings beneath a patch of shade. The melody drifted softly through the air before dissolving into the sounds of sandals, animals, and distant voices. Everything felt slow beneath the heat. Time itself seemed heavier during Egyptian afternoons. Along the Nile, fishermen repaired torn sections of net while waiting for evening waters. Their fingers moved carefully through rough fibers worn thin from constant use. One old fisherman sat silently for long stretches staring across the river. His face looked carved by sunlight and years. He had spent nearly his entire life beside these waters. As a boy he learned the currents from his father. As a young man he rowed long distances before dawn searching for better catches. Later he taught his own sons the same work. The river passed through generations quietly. Children became workers. Workers became old. Old people disappeared. And still the Nile continued flowing north beneath the same sun. Near midday, heat shimmered above the roads outside town. Travelers moved slowly between settlements carrying goods upon donkeys or across their shoulders. Dust clung to skin almost immediately. One merchant rested beneath an acacia tree while drinking carefully from a small water skin. His sandals were cracked from long journeys. Beside him lay bundles of copper tools wrapped in cloth for trading farther south. Travel through Egypt demanded endurance. Roads were rough. Shade was rare. The sun showed little mercy. Most ordinary people never traveled far from where they were born. Villages became entire worlds. The river, nearby fields, neighboring homes, and local markets formed the boundaries of daily life. Even so, stories traveled. Boatmen carried news along the Nile. Merchants repeated rumors from distant towns. Temple priests spoke of royal projects far away. Children listened quietly while adults discussed such things beside evening fires, though most of those distant events changed little about ordinary labor waiting the next morning. As afternoon deepened, the smell of baking bread drifted once more across the village. Inside one home, a woman pressed dough against the inner wall of a clay oven while wiping sweat from her face with the edge of her linen cloth. The room was unbearably warm. Firelight flickered against mud brick walls already heated by the sun outside. Her youngest daughter slept nearby despite the heat, curled quietly upon a reed mat. An older son returned from the fields carrying onions and a small bundle of greens. Dirt covered his ankles. His shoulders sagged with exhaustion though he was still young. The mother handed him water immediately. He drank slowly. Water mattered deeply in the Nile Valley. Not simply because of thirst, but because survival itself depended on careful balance between river, field, and body. During difficult seasons, anxiety spread quickly through villages when floodwaters arrived poorly or crops failed beneath disease or insects. Ordinary life always rested close to uncertainty. And perhaps that was part of why evenings felt so precious. As the sunlight finally softened toward gold again, workers began their slow return home. Long shadows stretched across the irrigation channels. Birds gathered near reeds beside the riverbanks. The worst heat passed little by little. Farmers washed dirt from their feet in shallow water before entering their homes. Children carried smaller bundles behind them. Older workers moved stiffly after bending all day beneath the sun. A girl walked beside her grandmother along the village road while balancing bread upon her head. Warm wind moved gently through palm leaves overhead. Somewhere nearby, someone played a soft flute melody drifting between homes. Cooking fires brightened the growing dusk. The smell of lentils and onions filled the air. Families gathered once more in doorways, courtyards, and rooftops where cooler night air slowly returned after sunset. A father mended fishing rope while his children listened to stories beside him. An old woman rubbed oil into aching knees before lying down to rest. Two brothers argued sleepily over space on a woven mat before exhaustion finally quieted them both. Above the Nile Valley, stars emerged one by one into the darkening sky. And once again, the river moved softly through the night beside a world that never truly became easy, only familiar. Before the first light touched the Nile again, the world rested in a deep blue silence. The river moved quietly beside sleeping fields. Palm trees stood still against the fading stars. Somewhere far across the dark water, a dog barked once and then stopped. Most of the village remained asleep, though not deeply. People who worked hard every day often slept lightly. The body learned to wake easily after years of listening for crying children, wandering animals, rising wind, or the sound of someone calling before dawn. Inside one small home near the edge of the fields, an elderly man opened his eyes slowly in the darkness. His joints hurt before he even stood. For a moment he remained still upon the reed mat, listening to the quiet breathing around him. His grandchildren slept nearby beneath thin linen coverings. The room smelled faintly of dust, smoke, and dry straw stored against the wall. He rubbed his knees carefully before rising. Age in ancient Egypt often arrived early. Years of lifting, carrying, grinding, digging, rowing, and walking beneath the sun wore bodies down long before old age fully came. Many people lost teeth early. Many walked with stiff backs or swollen hands. Eyes weakened from dust and bright light. Still, the work usually continued. The old man stepped outside into the cool darkness carrying a small clay lamp. The air felt gentle against his skin before the coming heat. Above him, the stars slowly faded while a pale silver line appeared over the eastern horizon. Soon the village would wake again. He walked quietly toward the animal enclosure beside the house. Goats shifted softly as he approached. One young animal pressed its nose against his hand, searching for food. The old man smiled faintly. Small moments like this mattered more than grand victories or royal ceremonies. Ordinary life was built from these quiet pieces. The feeling of cool air before sunrise. The sound of animals breathing nearby. Warm bread shared between tired people. A child falling asleep against a parent's shoulder after a long day. These things shaped most human lives beside the Nile. Across the village, small fires slowly awakened one by one. Thin smoke drifted upward into the dim sky. Women prepared grain for grinding while still half asleep themselves. Some hummed softly under their breath while working. Others remained silent, saving energy for the long hours ahead. In one courtyard, two sisters knelt beside a grinding stone. Their movements were slow and practiced. Push. Pull. Push again. Fine grain dust gathered across their arms and clothing. The younger sister yawned repeatedly. The older one smiled without looking up. They had done this almost every morning for as long as they could remember. Nearby, a baby stirred awake beside folded blankets while his mother mixed dough in a clay bowl. She shifted him gently onto her hip without stopping her work. Her body moved automatically through familiar routines learned from her own mother years earlier. Outside, the eastern sky brightened gradually into soft gold. Birds began calling from the reeds beside the river. The Nile appeared again from the darkness, smooth and wide beneath the first morning light. Small fishing boats drifted away from shore carrying men whose silhouettes blurred against the glowing water. The day returned quietly. Along the village roads, workers began walking toward the fields in small groups. Their sandals pressed into cool dirt still holding traces of night moisture. Some carried wooden hoes. Others balanced baskets or water jars carefully across their shoulders. A young mother walked with her two sons beside her. The older boy carried tools. The younger one carried nothing yet. But soon he would. That was simply how life moved forward. Children watched constantly. They learned by standing nearby while adults worked. How to shape bread. How to weave baskets. How to mend fishing nets. How to cut reeds. How to guide animals. How to survive heat and exhaustion without complaint. There was little space between learning and doing. Near the irrigation channels, farmers inspected the water levels before beginning their labor. Mud squished beneath their feet while insects hovered over the still water. The smell rising from the earth was rich and heavy. One farmer crouched beside a young crop and touched the leaves carefully. Too little water could ruin everything. Too much could also destroy the fields. Every season carried worry beneath the routine. The Nile gave life generously, but life beside it still demanded endless attention. Irrigation walls cracked. Crops failed. Animals became sick. Floods sometimes arrived poorly. Ordinary families lived close to hunger more often than later generations might imagine. And yet the work continued steadily each morning beneath the rising sun. Farther north, near a larger town lined with workshops and storage buildings, laborers already crowded the streets before full daylight. Donkeys loaded with sacks of grain moved slowly between market spaces. Temple servants swept dust from stone entrances. Bakers arranged fresh loaves upon woven trays while flies gathered lazily around them. The smell of warm bread drifted through the air. Along one narrow street, a young pottery worker carried stacked clay bowls toward a kiln. The heat from the firing ovens never fully disappeared, even during early morning hours. His arms trembled slightly beneath the weight, but he kept walking carefully. A single broken bowl meant lost labor. Inside another workshop, carpenters shaped wood beneath hanging oil lamps still glowing faintly from the night before. Sawdust covered the floor. The room smelled dry and sharp. One apprentice rubbed sleep from his eyes while sanding rough edges from a wooden stool. His master barely looked up. Work began early because cooler hours mattered. Once the midday heat arrived, every task became slower and heavier. Outside the workshop district, women gathered at a public water area beside the riverbank. Clay jars lined the ground beside their feet while they waited their turn. Some spoke softly together. Others stared quietly toward the water, still waking fully. A little girl played nearby using reeds to draw patterns in wet mud. Her mother called her back gently before filling another jar. The weight of water shaped daily life deeply. Carrying it required time and strength every single day. Most homes lacked easy storage for large amounts. Water was gathered, lifted, poured, carried, and rationed constantly. Many shoulders became permanently sore from the effort. As sunlight spread higher across the Nile Valley, warmth returned quickly. The pale walls of homes reflected bright light into the roads. Dust rose beneath passing feet. Sweat formed along necks and backs long before midday arrived. A group of stone workers moved together toward a construction site carrying ropes and copper tools. Their conversation remained quiet and slow. One younger laborer limped slightly from an old injury but continued walking with the others. No one expected work to stop simply because the body hurt. Pain became part of ordinary life. Hands blistered. Backs strained. Feet cracked from heat and rough ground. Still the labor continued because families depended on it. At the construction site, massive limestone blocks waited beneath the growing sun. Workers positioned wooden sledges carefully while overseers watched from patches of shade. The men pulled together against thick ropes, muscles tightening beneath sweat-covered skin. The stone moved inch by inch across damp earth. Breathing grew heavy. Dust clung to every surface. Nearby, another laborer poured water over the ground to reduce friction while flies buzzed around his face. Most monumental buildings in ancient Egypt were created through this kind of exhausting human effort repeated endlessly under harsh conditions. The names remembered by history were often kings or nobles, but the true weight of construction rested upon ordinary bodies. Bodies that became tired. Bodies that aged quickly. Bodies that sometimes collapsed from heat beneath the open sky. As morning deepened toward noon, shadows shortened across the roads and fields. The Nile shimmered brightly beneath the strengthening sun. Palm leaves barely moved in the still air. Inside homes, women continued preparing meals for later hours. One mother sat beside a low clay oven shaping bread while her daughter cleaned lentils nearby. The room already felt unbearably warm. Sweat rolled slowly down their faces while firelight flickered across the walls. Still, there was comfort in routine. The daughter knew exactly how much water to add. The mother knew exactly how hot the oven should become. Their movements carried the calm rhythm of repetition learned over many years. Outside, the village dog slept heavily beneath scraps of shade. An old man repaired fishing baskets beside his doorway while humming quietly to himself. His fingers moved slowly now because age had stiffened the joints. Even simple tasks required patience. A few children played nearby for a short while before adults called them back toward chores. Play existed, but work always waited close behind it. Along the riverbank, fishermen sorted their morning catch beneath reed coverings. Silver scales glimmered briefly in the sunlight before being packed into baskets or laid out for drying. The smell of fish mixed with river mud and warm reeds. One fisherman sat with his feet in the water resting his eyes. His shoulders burned from rowing. His hands carried cuts from rough rope. Still, the river gave him food, and so he returned to it each day. A young boy beside him practiced knotting fishing line carefully beneath his father's watchful eye. The boy struggled with the fibers at first. His fingers were still small. The father corrected him patiently. One day those same hands would pull nets from the Nile before sunrise, just as generations before him had done. The cycle continued quietly. Morning became afternoon. Children became workers. Workers became elders. And the river kept flowing beside them all. By midday the heat pressed heavily over the land once more. Air above the roads shimmered. Stone walls radiated warmth. Even breathing felt slower. Farmers paused occasionally beneath sparse shade to drink water from shared jars. Their linen clothing clung damply to their bodies. One woman wrapped cloth over her head while harvesting grain beside her husband and sons. Nobody spoke much during the hottest hours. Speech itself required energy. The world seemed to grow quieter beneath intense heat. Birds disappeared into shade. Animals rested motionless. Human movement slowed to a careful pace. Only insects continued buzzing endlessly near the water channels. Inside a temple storage room, scribes sat cross-legged recording grain deliveries upon papyrus scrolls. The room remained cooler than the fields outside, though not comfortable. Oil lamps flickered softly against painted walls while reed pens scratched across smooth surfaces. One scribe flexed his cramped fingers after hours of writing. Even work performed indoors carried its own exhaustion. Nearby, laborers unloaded sacks of grain from donkey carts into storage bins. Dust from the grain filled the air and settled into noses and throats. Men coughed while lifting heavy loads again and again. The smell inside the storage building was dry and thick. Outside, sunlight blazed against the courtyards. Farther downriver, a merchant boat drifted slowly north using a mild breeze filling its square linen sail. The boat carried jars of oil, baskets of grain, copper tools, and woven cloth for trade between settlements. The crew moved lazily beneath the afternoon heat whenever possible. One sailor lay against bundled rope with his eyes closed while another adjusted the sail carefully. Water slapped gently against the wooden sides of the boat. Travel along the Nile could feel peaceful at times. The river breeze softened the heat slightly. The endless movement of water calmed tired minds. Many people who lived beside the Nile trusted the river more deeply than the dry desert beyond it. The desert felt silent and unforgiving. The river felt alive. As afternoon slowly leaned toward evening once again, shadows began stretching longer across the valley. The light turned softer. The heat loosened little by little. Workers in the fields straightened aching backs and gathered tools for the journey home. Dust coated their ankles and clothing. Some children walked half asleep beside their parents after long hours outdoors. The village slowly breathed out after another difficult day. Cooking fires awakened again. Bread baked inside glowing ovens. The smell of onions, herbs, and lentils drifted through narrow roads between homes. A tired mother washed her children's faces with cool water before the evening meal. An elderly grandmother sat quietly nearby combing dust from her long gray hair. Somewhere down the road, a flute began playing softly in the warm dusk air. And beyond the village, beyond the resting fields and darkening palm trees, the Nile carried the fading sunlight gently south into the coming night. Evening settled slowly across the Nile Valley, not all at once, but in layers of fading light and cooling air. The western sky turned deep gold behind the desert hills. Palm trees darkened into long shadows beside the riverbanks. The heat that had pressed against every stone and rooftop throughout the day finally began to loosen its grip. Workers returned home with heavy steps. Sandals scraped softly against dusty roads. Donkeys carried bundles of reeds, baskets of grain, and clay jars swinging gently from their sides. Children walked beside their parents with tired eyes and slow movements, their bodies still warm from the sun. The village smelled of smoke and bread again. Inside one narrow home near the edge of the farmland, a woman crouched beside a clay oven while turning flat loaves against the hot inner wall. Her face glowed orange in the firelight. Sweat still clung to her forehead even though the evening breeze had begun drifting through the doorway. Behind her, 3 children sat together sharing dates from a woven bowl. The youngest one was already falling asleep. His head leaned against his sister's shoulder while she absent-mindedly brushed dust from his hair. Outside, their father washed his hands and feet with water from a clay jar before entering the house. His body hurt deeply tonight. All day he had worked repairing irrigation channels beneath the burning sun. Mud had dried across his legs. His shoulders felt stiff from lifting heavy baskets filled with wet earth. Tiny cuts along his fingers burned from river water and rough reeds. Still, he sat quietly beside his family as the evening meal was prepared. There was comfort in simply sitting still for a while. For many ordinary Egyptians, moments like these were the softest part of life. Not because the world itself became easier, but because work paused briefly once darkness arrived. Families gathered close together. The air cooled. Lamps glowed gently against mud brick walls. The body could finally rest. Outside, the sounds of the village shifted slowly. Daytime labor faded into softer evening noises. Low conversation beside doorways. Goats settling into sleep. Clay bowls touching lightly together. The distant splash of river water against tide boats. A baby crying somewhere in the dark before being soothed again. Along the Nile banks, fishermen prepared for night work beneath the rising moon. Some fishing was easier after sunset when the air cooled and the water became calmer. Men checked woven nets carefully while standing barefoot in the damp mud near the shore. A young boy followed behind his older brothers carrying a bundle of rope. He tried not to yawn. The oldest brother smiled slightly and placed a hand against the boy's shoulder before helping him into the narrow wooden boat. The Nile reflected pale moonlight now. Gentle ripples moved beneath the vessel as it drifted away from shore. Reeds brushed softly against the sides. Farther out across the dark water, other fishing lamps flickered like tiny stars floating low upon the river. The fishermen spoke quietly while working. Most conversations at night became softer naturally, as if people did not wish to disturb the stillness surrounding the valley after sunset. Back in the village, families finished their evening meals slowly. Bread was divided carefully. Lentils were spooned into clay bowls. Fish was shared when available. Beer made from barley passed between tired hands. No one wasted food. Harvests could fail. Storage jars could empty too quickly. Illness or flooding could leave families struggling through difficult seasons. Even during peaceful years, ordinary life required careful use of every resource. A grandmother sitting near one doorway broke her portion of bread into smaller pieces before handing some quietly to a child beside her. The child smiled sleepily. The old woman's hands trembled slightly now from age. Her fingernails were cracked from decades of labor. The skin along her palms felt rough like worn leather from grinding grain over countless mornings. She had once carried water jars along the same roads where her grandchildren now walked. Years passed quietly beside the Nile. Not quickly. Not slowly. Just steadily. Children grew taller. Parents became bent from work. Hair turned gray beneath the desert sun. And the river continued flowing through every season without stopping. As darkness deepened, oil lamps flickered softly inside homes throughout the village. Their small flames cast warm shadows across walls painted by smoke and time. Some families sat awake a little longer, speaking quietly together before sleep. Stories often filled these evening hours. Not grand heroic stories most of the time. Simple stories. Stories about floods from long ago. About difficult harvest seasons. About strange dreams. About crocodiles seen near the riverbank. About relatives living farther north. About spirits believed to move through the desert after dark. Children listened carefully while lying half asleep beside their parents. Outside, the night air carried a faint smell of wet reeds drifting from the Nile. The stars above ancient Egypt often appeared brilliantly clear once darkness settled fully across the valley. Without large fires or crowded cities glowing against the sky, the heavens stretched endlessly overhead. Many people slept outdoors during the hottest seasons. On rooftops, in courtyards, near open doorways where the breeze could reach them. Inside one rooftop sleeping area, a young mother lay awake briefly while her children slept nearby. She stared upward at the stars while warm wind moved gently through her hair. Tomorrow would begin again before sunrise. The grain would still need grinding. The water would still need carrying. The bread would still need baking. The children would still need feeding. There was no escape from the rhythm of work. But there was familiarity inside it. Human beings often learn to survive difficult lives by becoming close to routine. Repetition creates a strange kind of comfort even when the labor itself remains exhausting. The mother closed her eyes slowly. Nearby, her husband was already asleep, breathing heavily after the long day in the fields. Farther down the road, an elderly fisherman sat alone outside his home mending a torn net by lamplight. His eyesight had weakened over the years, and he worked slowly now, squinting carefully at the fibers between his fingers. The village around him had mostly fallen silent. Only insects and distant river sounds remained. He paused sometimes just to rest his hands. The old fisherman remembered when his body had moved more easily. He remembered rowing before dawn beside his father many years ago while mist floated low across the Nile. He remembered carrying heavy catches back to shore without pain in his shoulders. Now even sitting too long made his back ache. Age arrived quietly in ancient Egypt. There were few ways to soften it. No gentle retirement waiting at the end of labor. Most people worked as long as their bodies allowed. And when the body weakened too much, families simply carried more of the burden together if they could. Near the larger town farther south, the streets had also grown quiet now. Market stalls stood empty beneath moonlight. Workshop doors were sealed for the night. Temple walls glowed pale beneath the stars. Only a few people still moved through the darkness. Night guards. Boat crews. Late bakers preparing morning bread. Temple servants tending sacred fires. One young servant girl crossed a courtyard carrying folded linen against her chest. Her feet hurt badly tonight from standing most of the day. The stone floors inside the estate had remained hot long after sunset, burning through the thin solace of her sandals. Still, she moved carefully and silently through the shadows. A wealthy household often remained awake longer than ordinary village homes. Meals stretched later into the evening. Lamps burned brighter. More servants continued working while others slept. Inside one cool inner room, a scribe leaned over papyrus scrolls beneath lamplight. His eyes burned with fatigue. Rows of symbols blurred slightly before him as he recorded grain numbers and deliveries for temple storage accounts. The room smelled of ink, oil smoke, and dry papyrus fibers. Outside the window, palm leaves rustled softly in the night breeze. Even quieter forms of labor slowly drained the body. Hours passed. The moon climbed higher over the Nile Valley. In the fields beyond the village, irrigation canals reflected pale silver light while frogs croaked softly along the muddy banks. The farmland rested now after the day's labor. Crops moved gently beneath the wind. For a few precious hours, the land itself seemed calm. Then slowly, long before sunrise, movement would begin again. In one small home near the riverbank, a child woke briefly from sleep. The room was dark except for fading lamplight near the doorway. He could hear his mother breathing nearby and the soft creaking of reeds outside. For a moment he listened to the river. Then sleep returned gently once more. The Nile had always been there. Before him. Before his parents. Before their grandparents. Always moving beside the mud brick homes, the dusty roads, the fishing boats, and the endless fields of grain beneath the Egyptian sun. And somewhere beyond the sleeping village, warm desert wind drifted slowly across the quiet earth beneath the stars. Long before sunrise, while the stars still hung above the Nile like pale scattered dust, the first sounds of waking returned once again to the valley. A soft cough behind a mud brick wall. The quiet scrape of a clay jar being lifted from the floor. Sandals brushing against packed earth. The world of ancient Egypt rose early because the heat allowed little choice. Work had to begin before the sun climbed too high above the riverbanks and fields. Inside one crowded home, a mother sat beside a grinding stone while the rest of the family still slept around her. The room was dark except for a small oil flame trembling gently beside the wall. Her hands moved slowly at first. Push. Pull. Push again. The heavy stone scraped grain into fine powder while dust gathered along her fingers and wrists. She had performed this labor nearly every morning since childhood. Now the motions lived deep inside her body like breathing itself. Outside, night air drifted through the doorway carrying the smell of damp reeds from the Nile. The woman paused briefly and stretched her aching shoulders before continuing. Pain often greeted people before the day even began. Nearby, her oldest daughter slowly opened her eyes. For a moment the girl stayed still beneath her linen covering, listening to the familiar sounds of morning work. The grinding stone. The low crackle of firewood. Her younger brothers breathing heavily in sleep. Then she sat up quietly and joined her mother beside the grain. No words were needed. The day had already started. Across the village, other homes awakened in much the same way. Fires slowly brightened courtyards and rooftops. Thin smoke drifted upward into the fading darkness. Donkeys shuffled near tethering posts while goats bleated softly for feeding. The eastern horizon slowly turned gray-blue behind the palms. Along the riverbank, fishermen prepared their boats by lamplight. Water slapped gently against the wooden sides while men checked nets and ropes with sleepy hands. One old fisherman rubbed warmth into his stiff fingers before tying another knot. His grandson stood nearby holding a basket almost too large for him. The child tried hard not to look tired. The old man noticed anyway. He rested a rough hand briefly against the boy's shoulder. Soon they pushed the narrow boat away from shore and drifted quietly into the darkness upon the Nile. The river at dawn carried a kind of stillness difficult to find during the heat and noise of day. Mist sometimes hovered low above the water. Reeds whispered softly along the banks. Birds moved cautiously through the fading night. The fishermen rowed slowly. Their oars slipped gently into black water without splashing. Far behind them, the village began glowing faintly beneath the first light of morning. In the fields beyond the homes, farmers were already gathering beside irrigation channels. The soil still held traces of coolness from the night. Bare feet pressed into damp earth while insects hovered over the water. One man crouched beside a canal wall inspecting cracks formed during the previous day. Beside him, his younger brother carried wet mud in baskets for repairs. The younger brother's back hurt constantly now, though he was not old. Years of lifting and bending beneath the Egyptian sun changed bodies quickly. Many workers reached adulthood already carrying the exhaustion of long labor. Muscles hardened. Skin roughened. Joints swelled from strain. Still, the work continued because the fields depended upon it. And the families depended upon the fields. As sunlight slowly spread across the valley, the Nile turned gold beneath the morning sky. Birds crossed low over the river while the first warm breeze moved through the palms. The village fully awakened now. Women swept dust from floors and courtyards using bundles of reeds. Bakers shaped dough beside glowing clay ovens. Children carried water jars from the river while trying not to spill precious drops along the way. A little boy stumbled on uneven ground and nearly dropped his jar. His older sister caught it quickly before the water spilled. She laughed softly. The boy looked embarrassed for a moment, then smiled too. These small moments of tenderness existed quietly inside hard lives. Near the market road leading toward the larger town, merchants arranged goods carefully beneath cloth awnings before the heat grew unbearable. Baskets of onions, garlic, dates, beans, dried fish, and barley bread lined the dusty street. Flies already circled lazily in the warming air. One merchant sat cross-legged beside jars of oil while rubbing sleep from his eyes. He had traveled several days by boat to reach the settlement and hoped the market would be good today. Trade was never guaranteed. Floods changed prices. Poor harvests changed everything. Sometimes merchants returned home with little profit after long difficult journeys. Nearby, a woman sold woven sandals while her young daughter slept curled beside the stall beneath folded cloth. Dust clung lightly to the child's cheeks. The mother adjusted the covering gently so sunlight would not wake her too quickly. As morning deepened, the roads became busier. Temple workers carried supplies through town. Servants hurried between storage houses. Laborers moved toward construction sites carrying ropes, wooden sledges, copper tools, and baskets. The air slowly filled with familiar sounds. Hammering stone. Animals calling. Voices bargaining. Water splashing from jars. Footsteps across packed earth. The entire valley seemed to move according to one shared rhythm tied closely to sunlight and river water. Near one large workshop, apprentices swept limestone dust from the floor before the day's carving began. The room smelled dry and chalky. Thin sunlight entered through high openings near the ceiling, cutting pale beams through the floating dust. A master sculptor sat quietly studying a half-finished stone figure. His fingers traced small details along the face. Nearby, two young apprentices lifted tools from storage baskets while whispering sleepily to each other. One had a healing cut along his hand wrapped with linen strips darkened from old blood. Injuries happened constantly. Burns. Blisters. Broken nails. Strained backs. Crushed fingers beneath stone or wood. Most workers simply endured them while continuing their labor. There were few opportunities to rest fully. Outside the workshop district, scribes gathered inside a shaded administrative building near the temple complex. Compared to the fields and stone yards, the rooms felt cooler and calmer. Still, the work remained demanding. One young scribe dipped his reed brush into ink while carefully copying grain records onto fresh papyrus. Sweat rolled slowly down his neck despite the shade. His hand cramped from repetitive writing. Beside him, an older scribe corrected mistakes with quiet patience. Literacy brought status, but not ease. Long hours bent over scrolls weakened the eyes and stiffened the back just as farming weakened the knees and shoulders. Every kind of labor shaped the body differently. Outside, the heat steadily strengthened across the Nile Valley. By late morning, sunlight reflected harshly from stone walls and dusty roads. The shade beneath palm trees grew crowded with resting animals. Dogs stretched motionless beside market stalls. Farm workers wrapped cloth around their heads and faces while harvesting grain under the blazing sky. Their sandals sank into dry soil between rows of crops. A young woman paused briefly to straighten her aching back. She stared toward the Nile for a moment. The water shimmered brilliantly beneath the sun. Then she bent once more toward the grain. Nearby, children gathered drop stalks into woven baskets. Their small hands moved quickly through the dirt. Dust covered their ankles and knees. One little girl hummed softly while working. Her grandmother had taught her the song during evening bread making many seasons ago. The melody rose quietly above the insects and warm wind. As noon approached, the heat became difficult to escape. Inside homes, cooking fires made rooms nearly unbearable. Women preparing midday meals wiped sweat constantly from their faces while stirring lentils or shaping bread. One mother sat beside a sleeping infant while fanning the oven with woven reeds. The baby's skin glistened from the warmth. Even resting felt exhausting during Egyptian afternoons. Outside, travelers along the desert roads moved slowly between settlements beneath the crushing sun. Some covered their heads completely with linen cloth while guiding donkeys loaded with grain, pottery, or tools. The landscape beyond the Nile Valley stretched dry and pale beneath the endless sky. Sand. Rock. Heat. Most people preferred staying close to the river whenever possible. The Nile carried life through the land like a long green ribbon surrounded by harsh emptiness. By midday, many workers searched desperately for moments of shade. Stone laborers rested beside unfinished walls while drinking carefully from shared water jars. Their bodies glistened with sweat and limestone dust. One man removed his sandals briefly and rubbed his swollen feet. Another leaned against a block of stone with eyes closed, gathering strength before work resumed. No one spoke much. The heat drained language itself from people. Along the riverbank, fishermen rested beneath reed shelters while repairing damaged nets. A warm breeze drifted over the water carrying the smell of mud and fish scales. One young fisherman fell asleep sitting upright beside a pile of rope. His father allowed him to rest for a little while longer before waking him gently. Even children carried exhaustion deeply. As afternoon slowly began its long descent toward evening, the sunlight softened just slightly over the valley. Shadows stretched longer across irrigation channels and dusty roads. Workers noticed immediately. Bodies seemed to breathe easier. The hardest hours were passing again. Near the village center, women gathered outside their homes preparing evening meals. Smoke rose steadily into the golden light while bread baked inside clay ovens glowing orange with fire. Children returned from the fields carrying empty baskets. Some walked quietly. Others spoke softly together despite their tiredness. An elderly woman sat near one doorway combing lice from a young girl's hair while both watched the evening sky darken slowly over the Nile. Nearby, a father washed river mud from his arms before lifting his sleeping son gently into the house. The child did not wake. The day had fully worn him down. And beyond the village, Beyond the fading fields and the quiet boats rocking against the riverbank, the Nile continued its endless journey beneath the warm evening wind. The evening breeze moved softly through the Nile Valley while the last light of day faded from the fields. For a short time, the world seemed gentler. The heat loosened from the mud brick walls. The stone roads cooled beneath tired feet. Smoke from cooking fires drifted slowly upward into a sky turning deep blue above the palms. Families gathered close together once more. Inside one small courtyard, a mother poured lentil stew into clay bowls while her children waited quietly beside her. The youngest boy struggled to keep his eyes open after spending the afternoon carrying water from the river with his older brothers. His head nodded forward sleepily. The mother smiled faintly and tore off a small piece of warm bread for him first. Nearby, the father sat against the wall rubbing soreness from his wrists. Today he had spent hours cutting reeds near the marshes beside the Nile. Tiny cuts lined his fingers from the sharp plants. Mud still clung beneath his nails despite washing. The smell of bread filled the courtyard. Warm. Earthy. Comforting after the long labor of the day. Meals in ordinary Egyptian homes were rarely large, but the evening still carried relief because work had paused. Even silence during supper could feel peaceful when bodies no longer needed to strain against heat and exhaustion. Outside, the village roads remained busy for a little while longer. Women returned from the river balancing water jars upon their heads with practiced steadiness. Older children guided goats into sleeping enclosures. Merchants covered baskets and goods against the coolness of night air and possible insects. The sounds of labor softened gradually into the sounds of rest. A low conversation beside a doorway. The rustling of palm leaves overhead. A flute melody drifting from somewhere near the river. The gentle creaking of fishing boats tied along the shore. In one narrow lane between homes, two elderly men sat together on low stools watching the darkness slowly settle over the village. Neither spoke very much. Both were tired. One man had spent his life shaping stone. The other had farmed fields beside the Nile since childhood. Their hands looked worn almost beyond recognition now. Thick fingers. Broken nails. Skin hardened by years beneath sun and dust. The stone worker's breathing sounded heavy when he moved. The farmer rubbed his knees constantly while sitting. Still, they watched the evening calmly together. Around them, younger families moved through the familiar routines of nightfall. Lamps were lit carefully. Bread was stored away. Sleeping mats were unrolled across floors and rooftops. Children often fell asleep before the night fully arrived. A young girl leaned against her grandmother while listening to a quiet story about the flooding season from many years ago. The old woman's voice remained soft and slow. The child barely heard the ending before sleep carried her away. The grandmother adjusted the linen covering gently over the girl's shoulders. Above them, stars slowly emerged into the darkening sky. The people of ancient Egypt lived closely with the night. Without bright lamps or crowded streets glowing after sunset, darkness settled deeply across the land once evening came. The stars appeared sharp and endless above the Nile Valley. Many people slept outdoors during warm seasons. On rooftops. In courtyards. Near open windows facing the river breeze. The night air brought relief after difficult days. Along the Nile banks, fishermen continued preparing for work beneath moonlight. Some repaired nets while others sorted hooks, baskets, and rope by the pale glow of oil lamps. Their shadows moved slowly against the water. One young fisherman sat beside his father learning how to mend torn netting. The older man guided his son's hands patiently. Again and again they repeated the same movements. Thread through. Pull tight. Turn. Tie. The son's fingers stumbled often, but the father never grew angry. These skills passed quietly from one generation into the next, woven into ordinary evenings beside the river. Farther down the shoreline, another group of fishermen pushed away from land in narrow wooden boats. Oars slipped silently into dark water while reeds brushed softly against the sides. The Nile at night felt almost endless. Cool wind moved gently across the surface. The moon reflected in broken silver patterns between slow ripples. Sometimes hippos could be heard far from shore. Sometimes crocodiles slid silently into the water near the marshes. The river gave life generously, but people respected its dangers deeply. Back inside the village, most homes had grown quiet now. Only the soft crackling of dying fires and occasional murmured voices remained. In one crowded house, a mother still worked by dim lamplight while the rest of her family slept. She repaired torn linen clothing using careful stitches despite her heavy eyes. Tomorrow the garments would be needed again in the fields. Her fingers moved slowly through the cloth. The room smelled faintly of smoke, oil, and sleeping bodies. Beside her, her youngest child shifted in sleep and reached for her absent-mindedly. The mother rested a hand gently upon the child's back before continuing her sewing. Even at night, work often continued quietly. There was always something needing repair. A sandal strap. A fishing net. A cracked basket. A roof damaged by wind. Life beside the Nile depended upon constant maintenance. Nothing stayed strong forever under sun, dust, and heavy use. Near the larger town to the north, temple courtyards rested beneath pale moonlight. Tall stone columns cast long shadows across the ground. Sacred fires flickered softly inside hidden chambers where priests still moved quietly through nighttime rituals. Temple servants carried water and cleaned floors long after most workers had fallen asleep. One servant boy leaned briefly against a cool stone wall to rest his legs before continuing his tasks. His feet ached badly tonight. He had spent the entire day carrying supplies between storage rooms beneath heavy heat. Still, morning would come again soon enough. Inside a nearby administrative building, a lone scribe remained awake recording grain accounts by oil lamp. His eyes burned from hours spent reading symbols upon papyrus scrolls. Ink stained the edges of his fingers dark black. Outside the narrow window, the town had fallen almost completely silent. Only distant dogs and river insects disturbed the stillness. The scribe paused to stretch his cramped hand. Then he continued writing. Throughout ancient Egypt, countless ordinary people remained awake deep into the night simply because work demanded it. Bakers preparing dawn bread. Guards watching storehouses. Boat crews traveling during cooler hours. Mothers caring for sick children. Laborers repairing tools before sunrise. Rest existed, but rarely in abundance. Even sleep itself was often interrupted by heat, insects, noise, or discomfort. Most families slept upon woven mats laid over hard floors. Pillows were simple wooden or stone headrests for those who owned them. Bodies learned to adapt. Children fell asleep through noise and crowded spaces. Adults woke quickly at small sounds. The rhythm of life allowed little softness. And yet there were still moments of peace hidden inside the hardship. A cool breeze moving across the rooftop during the middle of the night. The smell of river water drifting through an open doorway. The sound of a parent humming softly beside a sleeping child. The quiet comfort of knowing everyone had returned safely home after another long day. Near midnight, the village rested deeply now. Most oil lamps had gone dark. The Nile flowed steadily beneath the stars. Frogs croaked softly along irrigation channels while insects buzzed through reeds beside the riverbanks. Palm leaves rustled gently whenever the breeze shifted. An old woman lying awake on a rooftop stared upward at the sky while listening to the breathing of her grandchildren nearby. Her body hurt constantly now. Her hips. Her shoulders. Her hands. Years of grinding grain and carrying water had worn them down slowly. Still, she found comfort in hearing the children sleep safely beside her. Tomorrow they would wake before sunrise again. The boys would help in the fields. The girls would grind grain and carry water. Their childhoods would pass gradually into labor just as hers once had. This was simply the shape of life beside the Nile. Below the rooftop, the village remained still beneath moonlight. Mud brick walls glowed softly pale against the darkness. Tethered animals slept quietly beside storage jars and reed baskets. Beyond the final homes, the farmland stretched toward the river in long dark strips beneath the stars. And farther still, beyond the green life of the Nile Valley, the silent desert waited under the endless night sky while warm wind moved slowly across the ancient earth. Before dawn returned, the Nile Valley rested in a quiet darkness that felt deep and endless. The stars still shone clearly above the river. Palm trees stood motionless against the pale horizon. Far beyond the fields, the desert hills looked soft beneath the fading moonlight. For a little while longer, most of the world remained asleep. Inside one small home near the marshes, a young boy dreamed beside his brothers on a woven reed mat. His arm rested across a clay water jar still cool from the night air. The room smelled of smoke, dust, dried reeds, and old linen warmed by sleeping bodies. Near the doorway, his mother was already awake. She sat silently beside the cold oven, preparing kindling with slow tired movements. Her back hurt badly this morning. Yesterday she had carried water from the river many times because relatives had visited during the evening meal. Still, she said nothing about the pain. Complaints rarely changed the work waiting ahead. Outside, the Nile moved softly in darkness. Somewhere near the riverbank, fishermen were already pushing boats into the water. The sound drifted faintly through the sleeping village. Wood scraping against wet mud. Quiet voices. Gentle splashing beneath the oars. The fishermen preferred these hours before sunrise. The air felt cooler. The river calmer. And for a short time, the world belonged mostly to water, stars, and silence. Along one narrow path leading toward the fields, an elderly farmer walked slowly carrying a wooden hoe across his shoulders. He moved carefully now because his knees no longer trusted uneven ground. He had walked this same road for most of his life. As a child beside his father. As a young man beside his brothers. Later beside his own sons. Now mostly alone. The path itself had become familiar to his body. Even in darkness his feet knew where stones rested beneath the dust and where the earth dipped slightly beside irrigation channels. He paused briefly to look toward the eastern sky. Soon the light would return again. The farmer breathed deeply. The coolness before dawn never lasted long in Egypt, and people learned to appreciate it while they could. Nearby, frogs croaked softly from the canals. Insects hummed near standing water. A warm breeze carried the faint smell of mud and river reeds across the fields. The old man continued walking. As the first gray light spread slowly over the Nile Valley, more homes began waking one by one. Small fires glowed inside courtyards. Smoke rose into the still air. Donkeys shifted beside tethering posts while goats bleated softly for feeding. The village slowly came alive again. A young girl stepped carefully through the narrow road carrying an empty water jar nearly as tall as her waist. Her hair remained tangled from sleep. Behind her, her older sister followed with another jar balanced easily upon her shoulder. They walked toward the Nile together. The earth beneath their sandals still held traces of night coolness. Soon it would become hot enough to burn bare feet. At the riverbank, other women and children had already gathered. Some filled jars silently while still half asleep. Others spoke softly together about ordinary worries. A child coughing through the night. A leaking roof. A sick goat. Not enough grain stored for the next season. The river reflected the growing light beautifully now. Long strips of gold moved gently across the surface while birds skimmed low over the water searching for fish. The younger girl knelt carefully to fill her jar. The clay felt cold against her hands. For a moment she watched the ripples spreading outward from the riverbank reeds. Then her sister called softly for her to hurry before the roads became crowded. Back in the village, bread ovens were already warming. Inside one courtyard, two brothers carried baskets of grain toward a grinding stone while their grandmother fed reeds into the fire beneath the clay oven. Sparks floated briefly into the morning air before disappearing. The grandmother's hands trembled slightly now from age. Still, her movements remained practiced and precise. She had baked bread nearly every day of her life. The smell of smoke and fresh dough slowly spread through the road outside. Nearby, another family prepared for work in the fields. The father tied cloth around his head against the coming sun while his sons gathered tools from beside the wall. One boy yawned repeatedly. The father smiled faintly and handed him a piece of bread before they began walking. Children often started working long before their bodies felt ready for it. Sleepiness mattered less than necessity. The crops needed tending whether someone felt tired or not. Life beside the Nile moved according to survival more than comfort. As sunrise finally broke over the horizon, warm light flooded the valley. The Nile turned bright gold. Palm trees cast long shadows across irrigation channels. Mud brick homes glowed softly beneath the growing sun. And once again, the labor of the day fully began. Farmers spread across the fields carrying wooden hoes and baskets. Some repaired canal walls damaged by shifting water during the night. Others bent low over crops already growing thick beside the river. A mother worked beside her teenage son pulling weeds from a barley field. Dirt covered their hands and knees within minutes. Neither spoke much. The work itself required attention and energy. Nearby, younger children chased birds away from the crops by waving reeds and shouting tiredly into the morning air. Birds always returned eventually. So did insects. So did weeds. The labor never truly finished. Farther north near the larger town, workshop doors opened onto already busy streets. Potters shaped wet clay while water dripped steadily from their fingers. Carpenters hammered wooden joints together beneath shaded awnings. Linen workers sat cross-legged spinning thread between practiced hands. The entire town smelled of dust, smoke, warm bread, animals, and river mud. A young apprentice hurried through the streets carrying copper tools wrapped carefully in cloth. His master had sent him across town before the midday heat arrived. The boy's sandals slapped quickly against the packed earth road. Around him, the town moved steadily through familiar rhythms. Market sellers arranged goods beneath stretched cloth coverings. Temple servants swept stone courtyards. Donkeys pulled carts loaded with grain toward storage buildings. Water sellers called softly to passing workers. One old woman sat beside baskets of onions and garlic while fanning flies away with woven reeds. Her eyes looked tired already despite the early hour. Most people woke exhausted and simply carried that exhaustion through the day. Inside a nearby administrative building, scribes prepared papyrus scrolls for another long morning of record keeping. One young scribe flexed his cramped fingers before dipping his reed pen into dark ink. The room remained cooler than the streets outside. Still, sweat gathered slowly along his neck as the sun climbed higher. Writing demanded endless patience. Line after line. Symbol after symbol. Grain accounts. Tax records. Storage tallies. Names and numbers copied carefully by tired eyes beneath flickering light. Outside the window, laborers passed carrying stone blocks toward a temple construction site. The sound of dragging sledges echoed through the streets. At the construction grounds, workers strained against thick ropes while overseers shouted instructions above the noise. Limestone dust floated heavily through the air. One laborer stumbled briefly from exhaustion. Another reached out quickly to steady him before the stone shifted dangerously. Then the pulling continued. Bodies leaned forward together against the weight. Feet dug into dirt. Muscles tightened beneath sweat-covered skin. Most monumental structures in Egypt rose slowly from this kind of ordinary human suffering repeated day after day beneath relentless sunlight. By late morning, the heat strengthened across the valley. Shadows shortened. Dust rose from the roads in pale clouds beneath passing feet. Dogs searched for shade beneath carts and walls. In the fields, farmers wiped sweat from their faces using rough linen cloth while continuing their labor. Water jars grew warm quickly beneath the sun. One young woman paused beside an irrigation canal and splashed river water gently across her arms and neck. For a moment the coolness felt wonderful. Then she returned to work. Nearby, an older farmer straightened slowly from the field while pressing a hand against his aching lower back. Years of bending had curved his posture permanently forward. Still, he continued harvesting grain beside the others. The Nile Valley depended upon human endurance. Without constant labor, the canals failed. Without canals, crops failed. Without crops, villages starved. Everyone understood this deeply. Even children. Near midday, the sunlight became harsh enough to blur the distant edges of the desert hills. Warm wind drifted through the fields carrying the smell of dry earth and river water. Inside homes, women preparing midday meals worked beside ovens glowing with intense heat. The rooms felt heavy and smoky. One mother stirred lentils slowly while rocking a sleepy infant against her shoulder. Her older daughter kneaded bread dough nearby with tired arms. Flies circled lazily through the doorway. Outside, the village roads had grown quieter now beneath the strongest heat of the day. Movement slowed. Voices softened. Even animals rested motionless in the shade. Only the Nile continued flowing steadily beside the tired fields and crowded homes, carrying cool water through a world that rarely allowed bodies or minds to fully rest. By the middle of the afternoon, the heat settled over the Nile Valley like a heavy blanket that pressed against every living thing. The roads shimmered beneath sunlight. Mud brick walls radiated warmth back into the narrow village lanes. Even the wind felt tired as it drifted slowly across the fields and riverbanks. Most people moved more carefully now. Farmers bent over crops with slower hands. Laborers carried stone and wood with lowered heads beneath the glare of the sun. Children walking beside their parents dragged their sandals through the dust, too exhausted to lift their feet fully. The entire valley seemed to breathe more slowly during these hours. Near one irrigation canal, a group of workers rested briefly in the narrow shade cast by a sycamore tree. Clay water jars stood beside them, half buried in damp earth to keep the water cool for as long as possible. One young laborer drank carefully and passed the jar to the next man without speaking. Sweat rolled down their arms and necks. Their linen clothing clung heavily to their skin. Nearby, insects buzzed endlessly above the canal water while reeds moved gently in the warm breeze. A boy sat quietly beside the workers holding a sleeping baby against his chest. He looked no older than 10 or 11. Dust coated his feet and knees. His eyelids drooped from tiredness, but he stayed awake because his mother and older sisters were still working farther down the field. The baby slept deeply despite the heat. Children in ancient Egypt learned early how to sleep almost anywhere. On mats, on rooftops, beneath carts, beside ovens, near loud workshops. Exhaustion itself often became stronger than discomfort. Across the fields, women harvested barley beneath the harsh afternoon sun. The work required constant bending and lifting. Hands moved through rough stalks hour after hour until fingers became scratched and sore. One woman tied bundles of grain together while quietly humming beneath her breath. The melody rose softly above the insects and warm wind. Nearby, her daughter copied the movements carefully, trying to tie the bundles tightly enough that they would not fall apart during transport. The mother corrected her gently. Then the work continued. Farther toward the river, fishermen rested beneath reed shelters after the morning catch. Some repaired nets. Others simply slept beside their boats while the Nile moved quietly nearby. One old fisherman sat with his feet in shallow water while staring across the river without speaking. His shoulders looked narrow now beneath age and years of labor. His hands rested open upon his knees, roughened by rope and fish scales and sun. The younger fishermen nearby spoke softly together while sorting hooks and baskets for the evening. The old man listened but said little. He remembered when he had once worked through heat like this without needing rest. Back then his arms had pulled heavy nets from the Nile before sunrise and rowed long distances without pain. Now even standing too quickly made his knees ache. Still, each morning he returned to the river. Routine carried people forward even after strength began fading. In the larger town farther north, the streets had quieted beneath the afternoon heat. Many market sellers sat silently behind their goods while brushing flies away with woven fans. Baskets of onions and dates rested beneath stretched cloth awnings. Clay jars filled with beer stood cooling in shaded corners. Dogs slept beneath wooden carts. A merchant leaned against the wall behind his stall with closed eyes while waiting for customers. Across the road, a young servant hurried through the sunlight carrying folded linen toward a wealthy household. Sweat darkened the cloth at her shoulders. Her breathing sounded quick and tired. Inside the estate walls, servants continued working through the hottest hours. One swept dust from cool stone floors. Another carried water jars toward the kitchen rooms. Others washed clothing beside shaded basins while cooks prepared food over blazing ovens. Large homes offered shade, but not rest for those serving inside them. In one rear courtyard, a kitchen worker stirred lentils inside a clay pot while wiping sweat from her forehead repeatedly. The fire beside her glowed fiercely. Heat pressed from every direction. Above. Below. From the walls themselves. Nearby, another servant kneaded dough with tired arms while a child slept curled beside stacked baskets of onions. The child's face glistened with sweat even in sleep. Across town, stone workers continued shaping limestone beneath rough cloth coverings stretched to block some of the sunlight. The air inside the work area felt thick with dust. Hammering echoed steadily through the heat. Tap. Pause. Tap again. Tiny white fragments drifted constantly across the floor. One laborer pressed a cloth against his mouth before coughing into it. Limestone dust coated his skin and hair pale white. His eyes looked red from the dry air. Still, he lifted the hammer again. Nearby, an apprentice carried broken stone pieces outside in baskets nearly too heavy for him. The muscles in his arms trembled with effort. The overseer noticed but said nothing. Children were expected to grow strong through work. Weakness rarely received softness. And yet people still cared for one another quietly whenever possible. When the apprentice stumbled slightly in the dust, an older worker reached out to steady the basket before it spilled. Neither man spoke. The younger one nodded gratefully and continued walking. These small acts of kindness often passed unnoticed by history, but they filled ordinary life beside the Nile. As the afternoon stretched onward, the sunlight slowly softened little by little across the valley. The hardest heat began easing from the roads. Shadows lengthened beside the fields and walls. People felt the change immediately. Movements became lighter. Voices slowly returned. Children who had rested during the worst heat now wandered through the village roads again, carrying small chores from one house to another. One girl delivered fresh bread to her grandmother's home near the riverbank. The warm loaf rested wrapped inside linen cloth against her chest. As she walked, the smell followed her through the dusty road. Bread remained at the center of nearly every meal in ancient Egypt. Whole days of labor often surrounded its making. Grain harvested beneath the sun. Grain carried home. Grain crushed slowly beneath grinding stones. Dough kneaded. Fires prepared. Loaves baked against hot clay ovens. The work never ended completely. But the smell of fresh bread in evening air brought comfort to tired people returning home. Near the village wells and river paths, women gathered water for the night hours. Clay jars balanced gracefully upon shoulders and heads despite aching muscles from the long day. One older woman stopped to rest halfway home beside a mud wall glowing gold in the lowering sunlight. Her granddaughter waited patiently beside her. The old woman smiled faintly and touched the girl's cheek before lifting the jar once more. Together they continued down the road. At the edge of the farmland, workers gathered tools and prepared animals for the return journey home. Goats bleated softly while dust rose around tired feet. A father walked beside his sons carrying wooden hoes over their shoulders. No one spoke very much. The exhaustion of the day settled heavily across them all. Still, there was relief now too. The worst heat had passed. The evening meal waited. Rest would come for a little while. As sunset approached, the Nile turned deep gold beneath the sky. Fishing boats drifted slowly near the shore while birds crossed low above the reeds. Warm wind moved through the palm trees. The valley looked peaceful from a distance. Beautiful even. But inside every home and field, inside every workshop and boat, human bodies carried the weight of constant labor. Hands cracked from work. Backs stiffened early. Feet blistered against hot earth. Eyes burned from dust and smoke. The world did not soften much for ordinary people growing up beside the Nile. Children learned quickly that tiredness was normal. That heat would always return. That work waited each morning before sunrise. And yet life still held quiet beauty inside those routines. A cool drink of water after hours in the field. A child asleep safely beside the fire. River breeze entering through an open doorway at night. A shared meal after sunset. The soft sound of reeds moving beside the Nile under the evening sky. As darkness slowly gathered once more over the valley, cooking fires began glowing across the village. Smoke drifted upward. Oil lamps flickered alive inside mud brick homes. Families gathered together again while the river continued flowing quietly beyond the fields, steady and endless beneath the fading light. Night came slowly again to the Nile Valley, spreading across the land in soft layers of shadow and cooling air. The last sunlight faded from the riverbanks. Palm trees became dark shapes against a sky slowly filling with stars. The desert beyond the fertile land turned pale silver beneath the rising moon. After the endless brightness of day, the darkness felt almost comforting. In the village, Cooking fires glowed warmly behind open doorways while families gathered close together for the evening meal. The smell of bread and lentils drifted through the narrow roads. Somewhere nearby, fish roasted slowly over hot coals. Children sat quietly now. The energy they had carried during cooler morning hours was gone. Dust clung to their ankles and faces. Their eyes looked heavy from the long day beneath the sun. Inside one small home near the river path, a father divided bread carefully among his family while his wife poured beer made from barley into simple clay cups. The youngest child rested asleep against her lap before the meal had even fully begun. The father smiled faintly. He adjusted the sleeping child gently so she would not fall. His hands were rough from years spent lifting irrigation buckets and cutting reeds near the marshes. Tiny scars crossed his fingers. One nail had darkened from an old injury that never healed properly. Still, tonight he looked peaceful sitting beside his family. Outside, the evening breeze moved softly through the village. It carried the smell of river water, smoke, warm earth, and palm leaves cooling after the heat of the day. Dogs wandered slowly between homes searching for scraps near the cooking fires. Near the center of the village, an elderly woman sat beside a doorway grinding herbs slowly with a stone bowl while speaking quietly to her granddaughter. The girl leaned against her shoulder listening carefully. The old woman's voice moved gently through the night air like the sound of water against reeds. Many evenings in ancient Egypt passed this way. Not with great celebrations. Not with dramatic moments. Only ordinary people resting tired bodies after ordinary difficult days. For most families, surviving another day together was enough. Beyond the homes, the Nile reflected moonlight in long silver ribbons. Fishing boats drifted quietly near the shoreline while fishermen prepared for nighttime work. One young fisherman stood knee-deep in the water untangling rope beside his father. Small ripples moved around their legs while insects circled near the reeds. The father showed him how to check the knots carefully by touch alone in the darkness. The son watched closely. These lessons happened slowly over many years. Boys learned the river little by little. Which currents moved strongest after floods? Which sections held dangerous animals? Which seasons brought better catches? Which clouds warned of changing winds? The Nile became part of their thinking from childhood onward. Nearby, another fisherman lit a small oil lamp inside his boat before pushing away from shore. The flame flickered softly against the dark water. Soon the boat disappeared into the night. Back in the village, more lamps began dimming inside the homes. Families prepared sleeping spaces upon floors, rooftops, and courtyards where the cooler night air could reach them. Inside one crowded room, several children argued sleepily over space upon a woven mat before exhaustion finally quieted them. Their mother covered them lightly with linen cloth and brushed sand from one child's hair. Her own eyes looked tired enough to close immediately. But first she still needed to wash the cooking bowls, and mend a torn basket before morning, and prepare grain for dawn bread. Work often stretched into the night for women in ordinary Egyptian homes. The labor inside the household never fully disappeared. Cooking, grinding, sewing, carrying water, cleaning, caring for children and elderly relatives. The task simply shifted shape as daylight faded. Near the larger town farther north, temple walls glowed pale beneath moonlight. Tall columns cast long shadows across quiet courtyards. The noise of daytime labor had mostly disappeared now. Only a few sounds remained. Footsteps from distant guards. A donkey shifting in sleep. Wind moving through palm branches. Inside a storage room beside the temple complex, laborers stacked grain jars by the light of smoking oil lamps. Dust floated thickly through the warm air while scribes recorded deliveries upon papyrus scrolls. One laborer leaned heavily against a jar after lifting it into place. His shoulders burned from the effort. The scribe nearby barely glanced up from his writing. Everyone was tired. The hours after sunset often felt strangely calm because no one had strength left for unnecessary movement or conversation. In another part of town, a wealthy household remained awake longer than the surrounding streets. Servants crossed quiet courtyards carrying trays, folded cloth, and water jars between rooms lit by many lamps. One young servant girl paused briefly beside a stone wall to rest her aching feet. She listened for a moment to distant flute music drifting faintly from somewhere beyond the estate walls. Then she continued walking. Her day had begun before sunrise. Tomorrow would begin the same way again. Inside the kitchen area, cooks cleaned clay pots while smoke lingered thick beneath the ceiling. The warmth from the ovens still filled the room despite the cooler air outside. A kitchen worker rubbed her sore wrist slowly while stacking bread trays. Nearby, another servant slept curled beside storage baskets because she was too exhausted to walk back to the servants' quarters. The quiet rhythm of breathing filled the room. Throughout ancient Egypt, exhaustion lived everywhere. In the fields. In the workshops. In the kitchens. In the boats upon the river. In the bodies of children growing into labor before they fully understood what rest truly felt like. And yet people still found moments of tenderness within that exhaustion. A father carrying a sleeping child home after work. A grandmother singing softly while combing a girl's hair. A fisherman sharing extra bread with a younger worker. A mother sitting awake beside a sick child through the night. Human warmth survived quietly even when life remained difficult. Near midnight, the village settled into deeper silence. The fires burned low. The roads emptied. Most homes had gone dark except for the occasional trembling lamp near a doorway. On one rooftop, an old man lay awake staring upward at the stars while warm wind moved across his face. Beside him, his grandson slept deeply beneath thin linen cloth. The old man could hear the Nile from here. Soft water moving steadily beyond the fields. He had listened to that sound nearly every night of his life. As a child sleeping beside his brothers on crowded rooftops. As a young farmer waking before dawn. As a father worrying through flood seasons and poor harvests. Now as an old man whose body no longer trusted long days in the fields. The river had remained through all of it. The Nile carried memory quietly through generations. Children became adults beside its waters. Adults became old. Old people disappeared into the earth. Still the river flowed on. Below the rooftop, the village rested beneath moonlight. Mud brick walls held traces of the day's warmth. Tethered animals breathed softly in sleep. Reeds along the irrigation channels whispered whenever the breeze shifted through them. Far beyond the final homes, the fields stretched dark and still beneath the stars. And farther still, beyond the fertile land, the desert waited in silence under the endless ancient sky. After some hours, long before dawn returned, movement slowly began again. A baker rose from sleep beside cooling ovens. A fisherman woke to prepare his nets. A mother stirred beside her children to begin grinding grain. The cycle never fully stopped. Life beside the Nile moved in circles tied to sunlight, water, labor, and exhaustion. The world did not soften very much as people grew older here. Instead, people themselves became stronger, quieter, more patient. They learned how to carry heavy jars without spilling water. How to sleep through noise and heat. How to work while tired. How to endure hunger during difficult seasons. how to continue loving their families even when their bodies ached constantly from labor. And outside the sleeping village, beneath fading stars, the Nile continued flowing calmly through the darkness toward another waiting sunrise. Before the sun returned, the Nile Valley rested beneath a faint gray sky where the last stars slowly disappeared one by one. The air felt cooler now than it would for the rest of the day. A gentle breeze drifted across the riverbanks carrying the smell of wet mud, reeds, fish, and distant cooking fires beginning to wake again in the darkness. The village remained mostly silent for a little while longer. Then the first sounds returned. A grinding stone scraping softly inside a home. Sandals brushing against packed earth. A goat calling quietly from its enclosure. A cough in the darkness followed by the creak of a wooden door. Another day was beginning beside the Nile. Inside one small house near the fields, a mother sat cross-legged beside a low fire preparing dough while her youngest son slept with one arm stretched across her lap. The child's face looked peaceful in the flickering light. The mother moved carefully so she would not wake him. Her own body still felt heavy from yesterday's labor. Her shoulders ached from carrying water jars. Her hands burned slightly from the oven fire. A dull soreness rested deep in her lower back. But the grain still needed grinding. The bread still needed baking. The children still needed feeding before the fields called everyone away again. Outside the house, the eastern horizon slowly turned pale gold behind the palms. The Nile reflected the changing sky in long soft bands of silver and blue. Along the riverbank, fishermen prepared their boats in near silence. Their breath drifted faintly in the cool morning air while they untangled nets and checked hooks beneath dim oil lamps. One young fisherman yawned repeatedly while lifting baskets into the boat. His father handed him a small piece of leftover bread from the night before. Neither spoke much. Morning conversations often remained quiet until the body fully woke. The men pushed the narrow boat gently into the water. Reeds brushed against the wood. Small ripples spread outward beneath the moon's fading reflection. Soon they drifted slowly into the mist hanging low above the Nile. Farther inland, farmers were already moving toward the fields with tools balanced across their shoulders. The earth beneath their sandals still felt cool and damp from the night. One older farmer walked beside his daughter carrying a clay water jar together between them. The girl looked sleepy. The father smiled softly and pointed toward the brightening horizon. Soon the heat would return. Everyone understood this. The cooler hours before sunrise always felt precious because they disappeared so quickly. Near the irrigation canals, workers inspected water levels before daylight fully arrived. Mud walls often cracked during the night, allowing precious water to escape into the wrong fields. One man knelt beside a damaged canal edge pressing wet earth carefully back into place with his bare hands. Nearby, another worker gathered reeds to strengthen the repair. The smell of river mud filled the air. Insects buzzed softly above the still water. Birds called from the marshes as dawn slowly spread across the valley. For many ordinary Egyptians, life revolved completely around these canals and fields. Without careful irrigation, crops would fail beneath the desert heat surrounding the Nile Valley. Every person understood how fragile survival could become. One poor flood season could leave villages hungry. One sickness spreading through animals or crops could change an entire year. So the labor never paused for long. As sunrise finally touched the tops of the palm trees, warm golden light flooded across the farmland and village roads. The mud brick homes glowed softly. Thin smoke rose into the brightening sky. Children began carrying water jars back from the river. Women swept dust from floors and courtyards. Donkeys loaded with baskets moved slowly toward the market roads. The entire valley awakened together. In one courtyard, a grandmother braided a young girl's hair while the child ate pieces of warm bread fresh from the oven. The grandmother's fingers moved slowly now because age had stiffened her joints. Still, the braid came together neatly. The little girl leaned sleepily against her shoulder. Nearby, another child chased chickens through the dirt while laughing quietly before his mother called him back toward chores. Even during difficult lives, small moments of play still appeared like brief cool breezes during hot afternoons. But work always waited nearby. By early morning, the larger town north of the village had already filled with movement. Market stalls opened beneath stretched cloth coverings. Potters carried fresh clay jars into sunlight for drying. Carpenters hammered wood beneath shaded work areas. The smell of bread drifted strongly through the streets. So did the smell of animals, dust, smoke, and warm stone beginning to heat beneath the rising sun. A merchant arranged baskets of figs carefully beside jars of oil while his young assistant swept flies away with reeds. Nearby, a woman sold woven sandals while nursing an infant against her chest. Life moved slowly but steadily around them. Temple servants crossed courtyards carrying water and linen. Laborers guided donkeys loaded with grain toward storage buildings. Scribes disappeared into cooler rooms where papyrus scrolls waited for another long day of records and calculations. Inside one administrative chamber, a young scribe sat carefully unfolding fresh papyrus beside a low wooden desk. The room smelled faintly of oil smoke and ink. Sunlight entered through a narrow opening high in the wall. Already he could feel warmth building inside the room. He flexed his fingers before beginning his work. Line after line. Symbol after symbol. Hours of careful writing while outside the rest of the town sweated beneath the strengthening heat. Even quieter work demanded endurance. Nearby, in the stone working district, laborers prepared for another long morning beneath clouds of limestone dust. Heavy blocks waited upon wooden sledges while overseers checked ropes and tools. A young apprentice carried copper chisels from storage baskets to the worksite. His arms already hurt from yesterday. Still, he hurried because arriving late invited punishment. The construction ground slowly filled with familiar sounds. Hammering stone. Workers shouting together while pulling ropes. Dust scraping beneath wooden sledges. The low groan of heavy weight shifting across damp earth. One laborer wiped sweat from his forehead before the sun had even fully risen. Today would be especially hot. Everyone could feel it already in the stillness of the air. Across the fields beside the Nile, farmers bent over crops while birds circled overhead searching for grain. Women gathered vegetables into baskets woven from reeds. Children chased insects and birds away from young plants. One small boy sat beside an irrigation channel watching his baby sister while their mother worked nearby. The boy dipped his fingers into the cool water absent-mindedly. Dragonflies moved above the surface. The baby slept peacefully against folded cloth beside him. For a few moments, the world felt quiet and gentle. Then his mother called softly for help carrying baskets, and the boy stood quickly to continue working. Childhood beside the Nile often moved this way. Brief moments of stillness between responsibilities. Brief moments of cool water before returning to heat. Brief moments of rest before lifting another basket, carrying another jar, or walking another dusty road beneath the sun. As the morning deepened toward midday, the sunlight grew sharper across the valley. The shade beneath trees shortened. Warm wind moved through the fields carrying the dry smell of earth and grain. Workers wrapped cloth around their heads. Animals searched for shadow. Water jars emptied quickly. Still the labor continued. A woman harvesting barley paused briefly to straighten her aching back. Nearby, Her husband repaired a broken tool handle using strips of leather and wood. Neither spoke. The heat slowly pulled words away from people as the day wore on. Near the riverbank, fishermen returned from the morning waters with modest catches resting inside woven baskets. Silver fish glimmered briefly in the sunlight before being carried toward the market. One fisherman knelt beside the Nile washing scales from his hands while staring out across the slow-moving water. His eyes looked tired. Not from one difficult day, but from many years of them. And still tomorrow morning he would wake before dawn again, untangle the nets again, push the boat into the river again, and follow the same waters beneath the same sky. Because life beside the Nile continued not through comfort, but through repetition. Through endurance. Through ordinary people quietly carrying the weight of each day together while the river flowed endlessly beside them. By late afternoon, the Nile Valley moved in a slower rhythm, as if the entire world had grown heavier under the sun. The heat lay across the fields and roads like still air that did not want to move. Even the wind seemed to lose its strength, drifting lazily through palm leaves and over dry paths. People worked, but carefully now. Each movement measured. Each step deliberate. In the fields, farmers bent over barley rows that shimmered faintly in the harsh light. Their hands moved through grain stalks already warm to the touch. Dust clung to their skin and clothing, turning linen darker with sweat. One young man paused and pressed his palm against his forehead, wiping away sweat before it could reach his eyes. His breathing felt slow and heavy. Beside him, his father continued harvesting without stopping. Not because he did not feel the heat, but because stopping meant falling behind, and falling behind meant more work later under even harsher conditions. That was how days often worked beside the Nile. There was always a balance between rest and survival. Near the irrigation canals, women carried water jars back toward the village in steady, practiced motions. The clay jars were heavy, especially after long walks under the sun. One woman shifted the weight from one shoulder to the other and exhaled quietly. Her daughter walked beside her carrying a smaller container filled only halfway. The girl's steps were slow, but she did not complain. She had learned already that the day did not soften for tiredness. Along the riverbank, fishermen repaired nets beneath thin strips of shade. The smell of fish, mud, and wet rope mixed with the warm air rising from the Nile. One fisherman worked quietly beside his son. The boy struggled with a knot that refused to tighten properly. His fingers were clumsy, still learning the feel of rope under tension. The father guided his hands without speaking. Again. Slowly. Patience carried through repetition. Nearby, a small boat rocked gently against its tether while sunlight reflected sharply off the water. The river moved endlessly, unaffected by heat, labor, or fatigue. It simply continued. Farther inland, the town's stone streets became nearly empty during the hottest hours. Most people retreated into shaded courtyards or inside mud brick homes where the walls blocked some of the sunlight. Inside one home, a mother sat near a low cooking fire stirring a thin pot of lentils. The fire burned carefully, controlled to avoid making the already hot room unbearable. Her youngest child slept on the floor beside her, breathing slowly in the warm air. Flies circled lazily around the doorway but rarely entered the deeper shade inside. The mother paused occasionally to fan the child gently with a woven reed mat. Her face looked tired, but calm. She had already worked since before sunrise. Grinding grain. Carrying water. Preparing bread. Watching children. Now preparing food again for the evening. And still there would be more tasks after this. Repairing clothing. Cleaning tools. Preparing grain for tomorrow. Life in ancient Egypt rarely ended with a finished day. It simply shifted from one kind of labor to another. Outside, the village streets shimmered under the afternoon sun. A donkey cart creaked slowly past carrying baskets of grain toward storage. The driver leaned forward, guiding the animal with a tired hand. Even the donkey moved carefully now, its steps slower than in the morning. At the edge of town, a group of stone workers rested briefly beneath a rough wooden shelter. Their bodies were coated in pale limestone dust, making them look almost ghost-like in the harsh light. One man leaned back against a stone block with eyes closed. Another rubbed his hands together slowly, trying to ease the stiffness from hours of hammering. A young apprentice sat nearby holding a cup of water carefully as if afraid to waste even a single drop. No one spoke much. There was no need. The heat filled the silence completely. Above them, the sky remained bright and endless, without clouds to soften the sun. Across the valley, children who had been working in the fields earlier now rested in whatever shade they could find. Some slept on mats inside homes. Others lay beneath trees near irrigation canals. A boy lay on his side beside a mud wall, his arm resting over his face to block the light. His chest rose and fell slowly in sleep. Near him, a girl sat quietly picking small stones from her dress while waiting for her mother to finish work nearby. She hummed softly to herself. A simple tune repeated again and again until it faded into the sound of insects and distant wind. Time moved differently in these hours. Not fast. Not slow. Just heavy. In the larger town, scribes and officials continued their indoor work beneath shaded ceilings. Scrolls were written, corrected, and stacked into bundles. One scribe paused and flexed his cramped fingers. His eyes burned slightly from hours of reading symbols under oil light and filtered daylight. He looked briefly toward the small opening in the wall where sunlight poured in like a thin bright line. Outside that line, the world was burning with heat. Inside, it was only slightly less so. Near the temple district, workers moved stone offerings and supplies into storage rooms. The air inside the stone corridors felt cooler, but still heavy with dust and incense. Footsteps echoed softly against ancient walls. Somewhere deeper inside, priests prepared for evening rituals that would begin after the sun began to fall. Even sacred spaces could not escape the rhythm of labor and exhaustion. By mid-afternoon, the entire Nile Valley seemed to slow further. Even voices grew fewer. Even movement became minimal. The sun pressed down steadily, and everything beneath it adjusted accordingly. Yet life did not stop. A woman still walked home carrying water jars. A farmer still tended crops under the burning sky. A fisherman still mended nets beside the river. A child still followed an older sibling between tasks, learning silently through observation. And somewhere in each of them, there was a quiet understanding that the day would eventually shift again. It always did. As the afternoon began its long, slow turn toward evening, a faint change appeared in the light. Not dramatic. Not sudden. Just a softening at the edges of brightness. Shadows began to stretch slightly longer beside walls and trees. The heat, though still strong, felt less overwhelming than before. People noticed without needing to speak about it. In the fields, workers straightened slowly and looked toward the west. In the town, merchants began uncovering goods again beneath awnings. In the river, fishermen adjusted nets for the changing water as the breeze strengthened slightly over the surface. A sense of quiet anticipation spread gently through the valley. Not excitement. Not urgency. Just relief approaching. Even the Nile seemed to reflect the change, its surface catching more of the warm gold tones returning to the sky. As evening approached once more, the valley prepared for the familiar transition that had shaped every day for as long as anyone could remember. From labor to rest. From heat to cool air. From noise to silence. And beneath the slowly darkening sky, the river continued flowing steadily past fields, homes, and sleeping earth, carrying the day forward into night as it always had. Evening arrived gently, like a hand slowly releasing its grip on the land. The harsh brightness of the day softened across the Nile Valley. The fields turned gold, then amber, then quiet shades of brown and green as shadows stretched longer between the rows of grain. A cooler wind moved in from the river. It carried the scent of wet reeds, slow water, and smoke rising from early cooking fires. In the village, the return from labor began again. Farmers walked back along narrow paths with tools resting across their shoulders. Their steps were slower now, not only from exhaustion, but from the relief of knowing the hardest hours had passed. A young man wiped dust from his face with the edge of his linen cloth. His skin felt tight from sun and sweat. His arms ached in a deep, steady way that only long labor can create. Beside him, his father walked in silence. The father's posture was slightly bent, shaped by many years of bending over fields just like this one. He no longer spoke much after long days. Words felt unnecessary when the body already understood everything. Ahead of them, the village slowly came into view. Mud brick homes glowing faintly in the low sun. Thin smoke rising from cooking fires. Children gathering near doorways. Goats being led back into small enclosures. Life shifting from work into evening stillness. Near the riverbank, women finished their final trips carrying water jars home. The jars now felt heavier than in the morning, as if fatigue itself had been absorbed into the clay. One woman paused halfway up the path to rest the jar against her hip. Her daughter stood beside her quietly, waiting without complaint. A soft breeze moved through their hair. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then they continued walking. Along the river, fishermen pulled their boats back toward shore. Nets hung heavy with water and the faint smell of fish. The boats scraped softly against mud as they were secured for the night. One fisherman sat briefly at the edge of his boat before standing again to help his son lift the net onto dry ground. The boy's arms trembled from effort. The father adjusted his grip and helped steady the weight. No praise was spoken. Only quiet coordination shaped by repetition. Nearby, another group of fishermen cleaned their catch beside the water. Silver fish glimmered briefly in the fading light before being placed into woven baskets. The river continued to move beside them, calm and unhurried. As the sun dipped lower, the village filled with the smell of evening cooking. Bread baking inside clay ovens. Lentils simmering in shallow pots. Onions and herbs frying slowly in small amounts of oil. Smoke drifting through narrow streets and open courtyards. Inside one home, a grandmother sat near the doorway weaving reeds into a small basket while watching her grandchildren return from the fields. Their clothes were dusty. Their faces tired. But their steps carried a slight ease now that the day's work had ended. The grandmother's hands moved slowly but steadily. She had done this kind of work for most of her life. Weaving, mending, grinding, carrying. The rhythm of her movements never truly changed, even as her strength faded. One of the children sat beside her and leaned against her arm. The grandmother placed a hand gently on the child's head. Above them, the sky turned deeper orange. The Nile reflected the fading light in soft ripples that stretched endlessly north and south. Palm trees stood dark against the horizon. Birds moved low across the water before settling into reeds for the night. In the larger town nearby, market stalls closed one by one. Cloth coverings were tied down. Baskets were stacked. Empty jars were collected. Dust settled over the road as foot traffic slowly faded. A merchant counted a small handful of goods beside his stall, then sighed quietly and began packing the rest away. Another day completed. Not a day of celebration. Just a day of survival. Inside the workshop district, tools were placed back into storage. Wooden doors were closed. Kilns cooled slowly after long hours of firing pottery. The air still smelled faintly of heat and clay dust. A young apprentice stood outside for a moment, stretching his stiff shoulders. His master walked past without speaking, carrying a final tool inside. The apprentice followed. Work was finished, but only temporarily. Tomorrow would require everything again. As darkness began to settle over the Nile Valley, oil lamps were lit inside homes one by one. Warm flickers of light appeared across the village like scattered stars resting on the earth. Families gathered in small rooms and courtyards to share evening meals. A father divided bread carefully. A mother poured water or barley beer into cups. Children sat close together, quieter now than in the morning. The exhaustion of the day softened their movements. Even conversation became slower. More gentle. More spaced apart. Outside, the air cooled further. The heat of the day still lingered in the walls and ground, but it no longer pressed so heavily. Night was arriving. And with it, the brief softness between labor and dawn. On a rooftop near the river, an old man lay back on a woven mat watching the first stars reappear. His grandson slept beside him, curled under a thin cloth. The old man's body ached in many places. He adjusted his position slowly, carefully, so as not to wake the child. From here, he could hear the faint sound of the Nile moving beyond the fields. A sound he had heard all his life. In childhood. In youth. In middle age. And now in old age. The river never changed its rhythm. Only the people along it did. Below, the village grew quieter as more lamps dimmed and families settled into sleep. The last conversations faded into soft murmurs, then into silence. The night in ancient Egypt did not feel empty. It felt full of resting lives. Of bodies recovering. Of breath slowing. Of tomorrow already waiting quietly beyond the edge of sleep. And beyond the final homes, beyond the fields resting under starlight, the Nile continued its endless journey through darkness and time, carrying everything forward with it, steady and unbroken, into another morning that would soon arrive. Night deepened further over the Nile Valley, settling into a quiet so complete it felt almost physical, like a soft weight resting over the land. The village had fallen into stillness. Oil lamps were now few, their light small and trembling behind clay walls. Most homes were dark, holding only the slow rhythm of sleeping bodies. Even the wind had grown gentler, moving through palm leaves without urgency. The Nile remained the only constant motion. A long, dark ribbon under the stars. In one home near the riverbank, a mother stirred awake briefly when her youngest child shifted in sleep. She reached out without opening her eyes fully and adjusted the child's covering, making sure the night air would not feel too cold against their skin. Then she settled again. Her breathing slowed back into sleep. Outside, the rooftops of the village held scattered figures resting beneath thin cloths. In warmer seasons, many people chose to sleep outside where the air felt lighter than inside enclosed rooms. On one rooftop, a young boy lay awake for a moment longer, watching the sky. The stars above ancient Egypt felt close in the silence of night. Not distant. Not unreachable. just present, steady, and quiet. The boy listened to the sounds around him. A dog moving far down a lane. A faint splash from the river. The soft creak of wood in a nearby house as someone turned in sleep. Then even those sounds faded into stillness. His eyes slowly closed. Farther along the river, fishermen continued moving through the night. Their work often extended into darkness when the water was calm and the air was cooler. Small lamps floated on boats like drifting points of light. Each one reflected faintly on the river's surface, breaking and reforming with every gentle ripple. Inside one boat, a fisherman sat quietly mending a net while his son watched. The father's hands moved with practiced precision, even in low light. His fingers knew the pattern without needing to see it clearly. Rope passed through rope. Knots tightened. Tears closed slowly. The son leaned closer. He was learning not just skill, but patience. The river did not rush. Neither did those who depended on it. After a long stretch of silence, the father spoke softly, almost under his breath, explaining how the net would behave in different currents. His voice barely rose above the sound of water against wood. The boy listened carefully. This was how knowledge traveled in the valley. Not through writing, but through repetition, observation, and time spent together under the same sky and water. Farther downriver, another boat drifted slowly with a single lantern hanging from its bow. The fisherman inside rested for a moment with his back against bundled nets, eyes half closed. The river carried him gently as it moved. Even labor could feel like rest in rare moments like this, when motion became slow enough to blur the line between work and drifting. On the banks, reeds rustled softly. Small creatures moved through the shallow water, barely visible in the dark. The Nile at night felt alive in a quieter way than during the day. Less movement from people, more movement from nature. Hidden currents. Soft ripples. The slow breathing of a living river. Back in the village, a few lamps still burned inside homes where tasks had not yet finished. A woman sat beside a low fire repairing a torn linen garment. Her needle moved steadily through fabric by dim light. The stitches were small, careful, almost automatic. Beside her, a child slept curled on a mat. The woman paused occasionally to rest her eyes before continuing. Her body was tired, but the work could not wait for morning. Clothing was needed the next day. Water would need to be carried again. Bread would need to be made again. Life never fully paused. Only shifted form. In another home nearby, an elderly man sat awake on the floor with his back against a wall, listening to the quiet breathing of his household. He did not sleep easily anymore. His joints ached when he lay down. So he often stayed awake longer than others, watching the night pass. He thought of earlier years without urgency, without clear beginning or end. Time in the village had always moved in circles. Seasons returning. Floods rising and falling. Planting and harvesting. Working and resting. Life felt less like a straight path and more like a long, repeated rhythm shaped by water and sun. Outside, the wind shifted slightly. A cooler current moved in from the river, passing through the narrow lanes of the village. It brushed against mud brick walls and stirred sleeping animals lightly in their pens. A goat shifted in its enclosure. A dog changed position near a doorway. Then stillness returned. High above, the stars remained steady. The moon hung pale and quiet over the valley, casting soft light across fields that had been worked earlier in the day. Irrigation channels glimmered faintly like thin silver lines carved into the earth. Nothing moved there now except water. Always water. In the deeper night hours, even the fishermen eventually began returning to shore. One by one, boats drifted back toward land, their lanterns dimming as they neared the village edges. Ropes were tied. Nets gathered. Wood creaked softly against wood. The men stepped out onto damp earth with slow, careful movements, their bodies tired but steady. A boy stumbled slightly as he climbed from the boat, and his father caught him gently before he fell. No words were exchanged. Only a quiet hand on the shoulder. Then they walked together toward home. Inside the village, more lamps had gone out now. Darkness filled most homes completely, broken only by faint moonlight slipping through doorways and cracks in walls. People slept deeply in many places. On mats. On rooftops. Beside walls still holding warmth from the day. Children pressed close to parents. Elderly bodies rested in stillness. Workers who had carried heavy loads all day lay unmoving, finally released from effort. The Nile continued flowing beyond them, unchanged by sleep or exhaustion. As the night reached its deepest point, even the last movements quieted. The river, the wind, the land all resting in a shared silence. And somewhere beyond the valley, beyond the fields and desert edges, the horizon waited quietly for the first faint suggestion of morning, still far away, still unseen, but already part of the endless cycle returning once again. The deepest part of the night settled over the Nile Valley with a stillness so complete it felt as if even time itself had slowed. The stars burned softly above the dark land, scattered across the sky like quiet lamps left hanging in an endless ceiling. The river moved beneath them in a long, steady rhythm, unchanged and patient. In the village, most homes were now completely dark. Only the faint outline of walls and rooftops could be seen under the pale glow of the moon. The warmth of the day still lingered in the mud brick, slowly releasing into the cooler air. Inside one home near a bend in the river, a family slept close together on woven mats laid across the floor. Their breathing rose and fell in a slow, shared rhythm. A child shifted slightly and tucked closer against a parent's arm. No one woke. The night held them gently in place. Outside, a narrow path between homes led down toward the riverbank where reeds moved faintly with the wind. Small insects gathered above shallow pools of water left from earlier irrigation. Their movement created a soft, almost invisible hum in the silence. Farther out along the Nile, a single fishing boat remained on the water. The fisherman inside had stopped working some time ago. Now he simply drifted. His hands rested on his knees, still holding the memory of rope and netting from earlier. The lantern at the bow burned low, its light trembling slightly whenever the boat shifted with the current. He did not speak. There was nothing to say in the quiet hours of night. The river carried him slowly past dark silhouettes of palm trees along the shore. Their reflections stretched downward into the water, broken only by gentle ripples. Everything felt suspended. Not asleep. Not awake. Just existing in calm motion. On the riverbank, a small group of reeds rustled as a night bird moved through them. The sound was brief, then gone. Even nature seemed careful not to disturb the valley too much. Back in the village, an elderly woman lay awake on her rooftop beneath a thin cloth. Her bones ached constantly now, especially in cold air, so she rarely moved once she found a comfortable position. Beside her, her grandson slept deeply, one arm stretched outward into the night air. The woman watched him for a long time without blinking much. She thought of how many nights she had seen like this. How many mornings she had risen before sunrise. How many days she had worked beside the river carrying water, grinding grain, preparing food, tending children, tending family, tending life itself. Her body had grown tired over the years, but her presence remained steady. Like the land beneath her. Like the river beyond it. In another part of the village, a lone lamp still burned inside a small workshop where a potter worked quietly even at this late hour. The clay wheel turned slowly under his hands. He shaped vessels by touch more than sight now, relying on memory and feel in the dim light. Each bowl rose gradually from spinning earth. Simple. Functional. Made for water, grain, oil, or storage. The potter paused occasionally to wipe his hands on a cloth and listen to the silence outside. He liked these hours. The world felt less demanding when most people were asleep. There was no shouting from markets. No movement of carts. No pressure of midday heat. Only clay, water, and breath. Outside, the wind shifted again, moving gently through the village lanes and out toward the fields. It brushed across sleeping crops and irrigation canals that reflected faint starlight. In the distance, the desert lay still and vast, a quiet boundary to the fertile land. No movement there. Only stone, sand, and cold night air. The contrast between the river valley and the desert was always present, even in darkness. Life gathered along the Nile. Silence stretched beyond it. As the night deepened further, the fisherman on the river finally turned his boat back toward shore. The current guided him easily now. No effort was needed to move in that direction. He adjusted the rope with slow hands and let the lantern dim slightly so it would not waste oil unnecessarily. When he reached the bank, the boat scraped softly against mud. A familiar sound. He stepped out carefully, his feet sinking slightly into wet earth. For a moment, he stood still and looked back at the river. It flowed without pause. Always forward. Always the same. Then he turned and walked toward the village, where faint outlines of rooftops and walls waited under moonlight. Inside the village, sleep remained deep and uninterrupted. Children rested without knowing the hours passing above them. Parents lay still after long days of labor. Elders drifted in and out of light sleep, listening to their own breathing and the distant sound of water. The Nile carried everything forward quietly. Not rushing. Not stopping. Just continuing. And above it all, the night sky remained wide and calm, holding the valley in a gentle darkness that would slowly, inevitably, begin to soften again when dawn returned once more. The final hours of night in the Nile Valley were always the quietest, when even thought seemed to slow and rest inside the bodies of sleeping people. The air had cooled fully now. It felt light against skin, drifting gently through open doorways and across rooftops where families slept beneath thin cloths and woven mats. The village lay still in its simplest form. No movement. No labor. Only breath and silence. Inside one small home near the edge of the fields, a young boy stirred briefly in sleep when the wind shifted through a crack in the wall. He did not wake fully. His hand only tightened around the edge of his blanket before relaxing again. Beside him, his mother remained still, her face turned slightly toward the faint glow of moonlight entering the room. Her body carried the memory of the day. The weight of water jars. The heat of the oven. The bending in the fields. All of it remained even in sleep, like a quiet echo that would return again with morning. Outside, the river continued its slow journey through darkness. The Nile did not change its rhythm for night or day. It moved with the same steady patience it had always carried through generations. Along its banks, reeds bent softly in the wind. Small ripples formed where unseen fish moved beneath the surface. The sound was barely audible, more felt than heard. Farther downriver, a lone boat still drifted, almost motionless now. The fishermen inside had stopped rowing entirely. His oars rested across the sides of the vessel. He leaned back slightly, watching the sky. The stars appeared especially bright in these final hours before dawn. Not because they had changed, but because everything else had grown so still. He thought about nothing in particular. Or perhaps he thought about many small things that never formed into words. The weight of nets. The smell of river water on his hands. The quiet mornings of childhood when he first learned to row. Time passed gently around him, without urgency. Eventually, he guided the boat toward shore again. The motion was slow and familiar. The river accepted the movement without resistance. When he reached land, he stepped out carefully and secured the boat with a simple knot. His hands moved automatically, shaped by years of repetition. Then he stood for a moment longer at the edge of the water. The Nile flowed past him in darkness, endless and patient. He turned away and walked into the sleeping village. No lamps burned now except the faintest glow in distant windows where someone still sat awake for a final moment before sleep. An elderly woman on a rooftop adjusted her position slightly and exhaled slowly. Her joints ached, but she no longer resisted the discomfort. It had become part of her nights, like the sound of wind or distant water. Beside her, her grandson slept deeply, untouched by memory or worry. She watched him for a long time. In him, she saw the continuation of days she would not live to see. Fields he would one day work. Rivers he would one day cross. Mornings he would one day wake into without knowing how many others had come before. Her hand rested lightly near his shoulder, not touching, just close enough to feel his warmth. Around them, the village remained wrapped in stillness. Mud brick walls held their quiet shapes under moonlight. Animals slept in enclosures. Courtyards lay empty. Roads were softened by dust and shadow. Even the sound of insects had grown faint. And then, somewhere beyond the horizon, the first suggestion of change began. Not light yet. Not dawn. Only a slight easing in the darkness, so subtle it could almost be imagined. The sky remained deep, but something in its tone shifted. The longest part of the night was passing. In homes across the village, bodies shifted slightly as sleep continued. Some people turned over on their mats. Some sighed softly. Some simply remained still, unaware of the world moving toward morning again. In the fields, crops waited under the cool air. Irrigation channels held still water reflecting faint stars. The desert beyond remained silent and vast, unchanged. And the Nile continued its steady movement through it all, carrying night gently forward, as it always had, toward another dawn that would soon arrive without hurry, without announcement, and without end. The last moments of night in the Nile Valley were so quiet that even the river seemed to move more softly, as if it too was resting between one breath of time and the next. Darkness still covered the land, but it was no longer deep and heavy. It had thinned slightly, stretched gently, waiting without urgency for the return of light. In the village, nothing truly changed at first glance. Homes remained still. Rooftops remained quiet. The narrow roads between mud brick walls stayed empty and dust-covered. But inside the silence, life was slowly preparing itself again. A baker near the center of the village was the first to rise. He sat up slowly beside his cooling oven, rubbing his hands together to bring warmth back into stiff fingers. The air in his small courtyard felt cool against his skin. He did not speak. There was no need. His movements followed the same path they had followed for years. Gather wood. Check the embers. Prepare dough. Wait for the fire to wake again. Farther away, a fisherman who had returned before dawn now lay still in half-sleep, listening without opening his eyes. He could hear faint movement already returning to the riverbank. Other boats being checked. Nets being lifted. Water shifting softly against wood. The Nile never truly slept. It only changed its rhythm. On a rooftop near the fields, the elderly woman opened her eyes slowly. The sky above her had changed without announcing itself. The deepest black had begun to soften into a dark gray blue. Morning was not here yet. But it was no longer far away. She turned her head slightly and looked at her grandson still sleeping beside her. His breathing was steady. Unaware of the world changing above him. For a long time, she simply watched him. The wind moved gently across the rooftop, carrying the faintest hint of cool river air. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called once, then went quiet again. Across the valley, more people began to wake. Not suddenly. Not all at once. But slowly, like the turning of something familiar and endless. A hand reaching for a water jar. A body shifting on a mat. A door opening carefully into the pre-dawn air. The village did not transform. It continued. The same life. The same labor. The same river beside it all. In the fields, irrigation water reflected the first faint suggestion of light. The canals looked almost silver now, even before the sun appeared. The crops stood still, waiting for the heat that would return later. And beyond the fields, the desert remained unchanged, vast and silent, holding its long stillness as it always had. The Nile flowed between them. Life on one side. Silence on the other. As the horizon slowly brightened, a thin line of pale gold began to form where sky met land. It was subtle at first. Almost uncertain. Then gradually it spread wider, touching the tops of palm trees, the edges of rooftops, the surface of the river. The valley began to glow again. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just gently, as it always had. People rose fully now. Fishermen returned to their boats. Farmers gathered their tools. Women moved toward the river with empty jars. Children followed older siblings into the early paths of work. A new day was beginning, though it felt less like something new and more like something returning. The cycle continued without beginning or end. Work would fill the hours again. Heat would rise. Fatigue would gather slowly in bodies as it always did. And then evening would come again, bringing brief softness before night returned. This rhythm had shaped every life along the Nile for as long as memory could reach. No one needed to explain it. No one needed to question it. It simply was. On the rooftop, the old woman finally closed her eyes again as the sky brightened around her. The boy beside her stirred gently, unaware of the full shape of the world yet returning to life below. The river flowed on. The fields waited. The village breathed once more into the coming day. And somewhere in the quiet distance, where water met sky and desert met land, everything continued steady, ordinary, and endlessly moving forward, like a story that never truly ends, only rests for a while before beginning again.